The alarm went off at 5:15 in the morning, just like it had every single day for years. But on March 1st, 2019, the bed where Andreen McDonald should have been stirring was already empty. Her husband Andre claimed he had no idea where she was, within hours. What started as a simple welfare check would transform into one of San Antonio's most disturbing criminal cases. A successful businesswoman had vanished without a trace from her gated community home, leaving behind a trail of blood, a mysterious burn pile, and a husband whose story kept changing. Good morning, and welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into a case that shattered the American dream and exposed the dark secrets lurking behind a picture-perfect marriage. This is the story of Andreen McDonald, a millionaire who disappeared in the middle of the night, and the investigation that would reveal just how far someone might go to destroy the life they helped create. Before we get started, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because cases like this one require multiple parts to tell the full story. You won't want to miss what comes next. Now, let me paint you a picture of what success looked like in San Antonio's upscale neighborhoods. Andreen McDonald was living proof that the American dream was still achievable if you had the drive and determination to make it happen. At just 29 years old, this Jamaican immigrant had built something extraordinary from absolutely nothing. Picture this: a young woman arriving in America with little more than hope and ambition, meeting an Air Force officer who believed in her vision, and together building a multi-million-dollar empire. That's exactly what Andreen accomplished when she founded Starlight Homes, an assisted living business that started with just 3 residents in her own home and grew into a thriving enterprise with multiple locations across the San Antonio area. But here's what made Andreen different from your typical successful entrepreneur. She wasn't just about the money or the status. This woman had a routine that would put military personnel to shame. Every single morning, 5:30 sharp, she'd be at the gym. No excuses, no exceptions. By 8 o'clock, she'd be in her office, ready to tackle whatever challenges the day might bring. Her employees knew they could set their watches by her arrival. Her dedication wasn't just impressive, it was legendary. This wasn't someone who took days off on a whim or disappeared without explanation. Andreen McDonald was the definition of reliability. So when March 1st rolled around and Andreen didn't show up for work, alarm bells should have been ringing immediately. But sometimes the people closest to us are the last to recognize when something's terribly wrong. The call came in from her mother, Maureen, who had been trying to reach her daughter all morning. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Text messages went unanswered. For a woman who was in constant communication with her family and business partners, this silence was deafening. When Bexar County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the McDonald residence in their gated community, they expected to find a simple explanation. Maybe Andreen had gotten sick and was sleeping off a migraine. Maybe there had been a family emergency that required her immediate attention. What they definitely didn't expect to find was evidence of violence. The house itself told a story that nobody wanted to read. On the surface, everything looked normal. The furniture was in place, nothing appeared to be stolen, and there were no obvious signs of a break-in. But when you looked closer, when you knew what to look for, the details became chilling. There was blood on the bathroom wall. Not a lot, but enough to catch a trained investigator's eye. Mixed in with that blood were strands of hair, and outside in the backyard, where Andreen had once maintained a beautiful garden, there was now a burn pile that hadn't been there before. Now, let's talk about Andre McDonald for a moment. This wasn't some random stranger who had wandered into their lives. This was Andreen's husband of several years, a major in the United States Air Force with top-secret security clearance. This was the man who had brought Andreen to America in the first place, who had liquidated his own retirement fund to help her start her business, who had been by her side as they built their fortune together. When deputies questioned Andre about his wife's whereabouts, his story seemed straightforward enough. He claimed that he had woken up that morning, gotten their young daughter Elena ready for school, and headed off to his duties at Lackland Air Force Base, where he worked as a cyber warfare analyst. Just another routine day in what appeared to be a routine marriage. But here's where things get interesting. Andre told investigators that when he learned his wife was missing, his first instinct was to check the local hospitals. He had a hunch. He said that maybe Andréan had suffered one of her severe migraines and had driven herself to get medical treatment. The surveillance cameras at the hospital captured Andre arriving and asking about a patient named McDonald. The staff directed him to room 3, where indeed there was a McDonald receiving treatment. Andre seemed relieved as he headed back home to share the good news with the deputies who were waiting for him. Except there was one problem. When the deputies called the hospital to verify Andre's story, they discovered that the McDonald in room 3 wasn't Andreen McDonald at all. It was a completely different person who just happened to share the same last name. So now we have to ask ourselves, was this an honest mistake made by a worried husband? Or was this the first crack in a carefully constructed lie? Andre's explanation was that he had rushed back home before actually confirming his wife's identity because he had forgotten his cell phone and wanted to call Andréan's mother to share the good news. He claimed there had been some indication that his wife was injured and receiving treatment. But unfortunately, his hunch had turned out to be wrong. But investigators were starting to notice patterns that didn't quite add up. While Andre appeared to be cooperative on the surface, there were inconsistencies in his timeline and gaps in his story that raised red flags. The more they dug into the McDonald marriage, the more complex the picture became. From the outside, Andre and Andréan appeared to be the perfect power couple. He was the decorated military officer with his steady government salary and security clearance. She was the entrepreneurial dynamo who had transformed a small home-based business into a multi-million-dollar operation. Friends described them as being deeply in love, always laughing together, constantly supporting each other's dreams and ambitions. Andre had sacrificed financially to help Andréan get her business off the ground, selling his BMW and cashing in his retirement savings to give her the capital she needed. And for a while, it seemed like that sacrifice had paid off beautifully. Starlight Homes wasn't just successful, it was thriving beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Within 7 years, what had started as a small operation caring for 3 elderly residents had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that employed dozens of people and served the San Antonio community. Andréan herself had become something of a local celebrity in the assisted living industry. She was known for her hands-on approach, her genuine care for the residents in her facilities, and her commitment to providing quality care for some of society's most vulnerable members. But success, as many of us know, can be a double-edged sword. The same drive and ambition that had made Andréan so successful in business had also made her the primary breadwinner in the McDonald household. While Andre had his military salary, it was Andréan's business acumen that had generated the real wealth in their family. And sometimes, when the traditional gender roles in a marriage get flipped, when the wife becomes more financially successful than the husband, it can create tensions that aren't immediately visible to the outside world. As investigators continued their initial examination of the McDonald home, they began to uncover evidence that suggested the picture-perfect marriage might not have been quite so perfect after all. The blood and hair in the bathroom were concerning enough, but there were other clues that painted a more troubling picture. The burn pile in the backyard wasn't just random debris. When crime scene technicians sifted through the ashes, they found something that made everyone's blood run cold: the zipper from one of André's blouses. The fabric had been completely consumed by flames, but metal doesn't burn as easily as cloth. This wasn't someone disposing of old yard waste or having a casual bonfire. This was someone trying to destroy evidence, trying to eliminate any trace of what had happened in that house on the night of February 28th and the early morning hours of March 1st. But if André MacDonald thought he had covered his tracks, he was about to learn just how difficult it is to make someone disappear completely in the modern world. Every purchase leaves a paper trail. Every movement can be captured by surveillance cameras. Every lie can be exposed by forensic science. The investigation was just getting started, and the secrets that the MacDonald marriage had been hiding were about to be dragged into the harsh light of day. Because when a millionaire vanishes from her own home, leaving behind nothing but blood and ashes, someone has to answer for what happened in those final moments. And André MacDonald was about to discover that his story had more holes than he'd realized. The reality of modern investigations is that secrets don't stay buried for long. Within days of André's disappearance, investigators had uncovered a web of deception that stretched far beyond that blood-stained bathroom and mysterious burn pile. André MacDonald's cooperation with law enforcement came to an abrupt halt when he realized the questions weren't going to stop with simple explanations. On March 2nd, less than 24 hours after his wife was reported missing, André made a decision that spoke volumes about his state of mind. He stopped talking to investigators and immediately hired a lawyer. Now, you might think that's just smart legal strategy. After all, innocent people have the right to legal representation too. But when your spouse is missing and every hour counts in terms of finding them alive, choosing to lawyer up instead of helping with the search sends a pretty clear message to investigators. What happened next was like watching a man unravel in real time. While law enforcement continued processing the crime scene and searching for any trace of André, they assigned an undercover investigator to keep tabs on André's movements. And what they observed over the next few days would convince them that they weren't dealing with a grieving husband anymore. On March 2nd, that undercover investigator noticed something strange. The garage at the MacDonald residence had been damaged somehow, and André was backing his vehicle out of the driveway with what appeared to be urgent purpose. The investigator followed at a distance, wondering where André might be headed during one of the most critical periods in the search for his missing wife. The destination was chilling in its implications. André drove straight to a local gun shop, where surveillance cameras captured him purchasing a 9mm handgun and ammunition. Think about that for a moment. While search teams were combing through wooded areas and volunteers were posting missing person flyers around San Antonio, André MacDonald was buying a weapon. Investigators had to make a split-second decision about what this purchase might mean. Was André planning to harm himself? Was he planning to harm someone else? Or was there something even more sinister at play? They couldn't take any chances. As André walked back toward his car, investigators moved in and took him down in what can only be described as a violent confrontation. The man who had been portraying himself as a concerned husband was suddenly face down on the asphalt, being detained by the very people who were supposed to be helping him find his wife. André was immediately turned over to military authorities for a psychological evaluation, but investigators weren't done with their search of his property. Armed with a search warrant, they returned to the MacDonald residence and began examining André's vehicle more thoroughly. What they found in that car was like a shopping list for body disposal: a shovel, an axe, a hatchet, trash bags, gloves, multiple gas cans. These weren't tools you'd need for regular home maintenance or yard work. These were items specifically chosen for a much darker purpose. But the real bombshell was waiting inside the family's garbage can, hidden among the regular household refuse. Investigators found a receipt from Lowe's hardware store. The receipt was torn up, as if someone had tried to destroy it, but hadn't quite finished the job. When they pieced it together, the items listed matched exactly what they had found in Andre's car. The timestamp on that receipt was crucial. These items had been purchased on March 2nd, the day after Andrian went missing. While her family was frantically searching for any sign of her, while volunteers were organizing search parties, Andre McDonald had been shopping for tools to dispose of a body. Security footage from the Lowe's store showed Andre methodically selecting each item. A shovel went into his cart. 2 gas cans followed, then a maul and an axe. The man on that surveillance video wasn't behaving like someone whose wife had mysteriously vanished. He was behaving like someone who knew exactly where she was and what needed to be done to keep anyone else from finding her. In the corner of the McDonald garage, investigators made their most damning discovery yet: a claw hammer, stained with what laboratory tests would later confirm was Andrian's blood. Nearby, they found clothing that belonged to Andre, also bearing traces of his wife's blood. For Detective Frank Stubbs, this evidence painted a clear picture of what had happened in the McDonald home during the early morning hours of March 1st. The hammer had been used as a weapon. The blood evidence showed that Andrian had been attacked in her own home. And Andre's subsequent shopping trip proved that he had spent the hours after her disappearance preparing to cover up his crime. But here's the challenge that investigators faced: having evidence of a crime and being able to prove exactly what happened are 2 completely different things. Despite all the blood evidence, despite the suspicious purchases, despite Andre's changing story and refusal to cooperate, they still didn't have Andrian's body. Turning a missing persons case into a homicide prosecution is incredibly difficult without a victim. Prosecutors need to be able to prove not just that someone died, but how they died, when they died, and who was responsible for their death. And all of that becomes exponentially harder when the primary evidence is missing. On March 3rd, after the Air Force completed its psychological evaluation and determined that Andre wasn't an immediate danger to himself, civil authorities moved quickly to arrest him, but they couldn't charge him with murder. Not yet. Instead, Andre McDonald was arrested for tampering with evidence. Based on that torn receipt and the tools found in his possession, the arrest sent shockwaves through the San Antonio community and devastated both sides of the McDonald family. Andre's mother, Jackie, was in complete disbelief. This was her son, a decorated military officer, someone she had raised to be responsible and honorable. The idea that he could harm anyone, let alone his own wife, seemed impossible to accept. Andrian's family was struggling with their own conflicting emotions. On one hand, they wanted justice for what they believed had happened to their daughter and sister. On the other hand, they were dealing with the horrible reality that the man they had welcomed into their family, the man who had brought Andrian to America and helped her build her dreams, might be responsible for destroying everything she had worked for. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire tragedy was the impact on 7-year-old Elena McDonald. This little girl had gone to bed on February 28th with both of her parents in the house. She had woken up on March 1st to find her mother gone and her father acting strangely. And now, just days later, her father was being arrested while her mother was still missing. The community response to Andrian's disappearance was overwhelming. Former Air Force serviceman Bobby Green organized volunteer search parties that covered hundreds of miles of terrain around San Antonio. These weren't professional search and rescue teams. These were ordinary citizens who had been touched by Andrian's story and wanted to help bring her home. They searched wooded areas behind hospitals, thinking Andre might have chosen locations that were familiar to him. They looked for disturbed earth, broken branches, tire tracks, anything that might indicate where a body had been hidden. Day after day, week after week. These volunteers continued their efforts even as hope began to fade. Meanwhile, Andre was released from jail while awaiting trial on the evidence tampering charges. Incredibly, he took over management of Starlight Homes, the business that Andréane had built from nothing. The same facilities that had been her pride and joy were now being run by the man suspected of killing her. As investigators dug deeper into the McDonald marriage, they discovered that the picture-perfect relationship had been hiding some serious cracks. Text messages and social media posts revealed ongoing arguments about money, business decisions, and control. There were allegations of infidelity on both sides, accusations about who deserved credit for their business success, and increasingly heated exchanges about the direction of their relationship. Friends who had once described the McDonalds as the ideal couple began sharing stories that painted a different picture. There had been physical altercations before, moments of tension that had made people uncomfortable. The night before a Christmas party in 2018, witnesses described seeing Andre and Andréane grappling on their kitchen floor, fighting over something that had escalated beyond words. For 4 months, the search for Andréane continued with no results. Investigators followed up on hundreds of tips, searched dozens of locations, and interviewed anyone who might have information about what had happened to her. But Texas is a big state, and hiding a body in the vast stretches of rural land around San Antonio wouldn't be impossible for someone who knew what they were doing. Then, on July 11th, 2019, 133 days after Andréane McDonald had vanished from her home, a farmer named Clifton Cundiff made a discovery that would finally bring this case to its tragic conclusion. Cundiff had taken his tractor out to retrieve a cow skull that had been spotted along the tree line of his property, about 6 miles from the McDonald residence. But when he got closer to examine what he thought was just another piece of farm debris, he realized he was looking at something much more significant. There, partially concealed by vegetation and scattered by months of exposure to the elements, were human skeletal remains. The bones that Clifton Cundiff had stumbled upon belonged to Andréane McDonald. The discovery of Andréane's body changed everything about this case. What had been a missing persons investigation with charges of evidence tampering suddenly became a murder case with physical proof of the crime. Andre McDonald was arrested again, this time charged with the murder of his wife. The trial that followed would reveal the full extent of what had happened in the McDonald home during those final hours. Andre's own testimony would provide details that no one could have imagined, admitting to actions that were so brutal and calculated that they shocked even experienced investigators. After being found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, Andre McDonald was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The jury had rejected his claims of self-defense but couldn't unanimously agree that his actions had been premeditated murder. Today, Andréane's mother Maureen and sister Cindy are raising young Elena, trying to help her process the unimaginable trauma of losing both parents in such a violent way. The Starlight Homes business that Andréane had built with such dedication and care has been closed. Another casualty of the violence that destroyed the McDonald family. The American dream that Andréane McDonald had pursued so successfully had been cut short by the very person who had helped her achieve it. Her story serves as a reminder that success and wealth can't protect us from the people closest to us, and that sometimes the greatest dangers come from within our own homes. Andréane McDonald came to America with nothing but hope and determination. She built an empire, touched countless lives through her work, and created something meaningful that served her community. Her legacy should have been one of inspiration and achievement. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about trust, ambition, and the devastating consequences when love turns to jealousy and control. If you found this case as compelling and tragic as I did, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. Cases like this one require us to examine the complex dynamics of domestic relationships and the warning signs that might help prevent future tragedies. Let me know in the comments what aspects of this case you found most disturbing and what you think could have been done differently to save Andrean's life. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember that the people we trust the most sometimes have the greatest power to hurt us. Looking at this tragic case that shook a college community to its core, we need to examine how a promising young nursing student's life was cut short by someone she thought she could trust. Tonight, we're diving deep into the murder of Haley Anderson, a case that would span 2 countries and raise questions about justice, obsession, and the warning signs we sometimes choose to ignore. It was March 2018 when 22-year-old Haley Anderson disappeared from her off-campus apartment near Binghamton University. What started as concern among friends quickly escalated into a nightmare that would expose the dark side of a relationship gone terribly wrong. Haley Anderson embodied everything you'd expect from a dedicated nursing student approaching graduation. Her friends described her as a free spirit with an infectious energy that drew people to her. She was the type of person who trusted everyone she met, always seeing the good in people even when others warned her to be more cautious. This trusting nature would ultimately become both her greatest strength and her fatal weakness. Born and raised in Westbury, New York, Haley had worked tirelessly throughout her college years to achieve her dream of becoming a nurse. By March 2018, graduation was just around the corner, and she had already secured a nursing position back home. Her mother, Karen, was planning a celebration party, excited to have her daughter close again after years of college life upstate. But Haley's plans extended far beyond that first job. She dreamed of traveling to California, buying a hippie van, and working as a traveling nurse while exploring the country. It was a plan that perfectly captured her adventurous spirit and desire for freedom. At Binghamton University, Haley had cultivated a close group of friends who became like family to her. She lived in an off-campus apartment with roommates who knew her daily routines, her habits, and most importantly, when something was wrong. Among her social circle was Kevin Ocampo, her on-and-off boyfriend who genuinely loved her but understood that Haley wasn't ready for a serious commitment. She had made it clear that she wanted to experience freedom after graduation before settling down with anyone. It was through Kevin that Haley first encountered Orlando Tercero, a fellow nursing student who would eventually become the center of this tragic story. Orlando was born in Miami but raised in Nicaragua, coming from a well-to-do family with medical connections. His father was a physician, which likely influenced Orlando's decision to pursue nursing. By all accounts, he was a good student who worked hard during the week and enjoyed socializing on weekends. The initial meeting between Haley and Orlando happened in their nursing classes, but they didn't really connect until a party at Kevin's apartment during Haley's 4th year. Orlando and Kevin bonded over their shared Hispanic background and ability to speak Spanish, leading Kevin to invite Orlando to join his fraternity. What began as a friendship between the three of them gradually shifted into something more complicated. When Haley and Kevin took one of their breaks, Orlando crossed a line by pursuing Haley romantically. This created tension within their friend group, especially when Orlando's fraternity brothers pushed him out for getting involved with Kevin's girlfriend. The relationship between Haley and Orlando developed into its own on and off dynamic. Friends described their interactions as volatile, ranging from hysterical laughter to heated arguments. Sometimes they would avoid each other for weeks. Other times, Orlando would be staying over at Haley's apartment. But according to those closest to the situation, Haley had been crystal clear from the beginning that she didn't want a committed relationship with Orlando. She was focused on finishing school and maintaining her independence. Orlando, however, seemed to have different ideas about where their relationship was heading. Haley's roommate Josie began noticing concerning behavior from Orlando. He would show up at their apartment uninvited, sometimes just to smoke a cigarette on their porch. He would drive by their house repeatedly, and Josie often found herself in the position of having to ask him to leave because Haley found it difficult to be direct with him herself. The red flags became impossible to ignore when jealousy entered the picture. Orlando clearly struggled with the fact that Haley was seeing other people and maintaining her relationship with Kevin. His possessive behavior began escalating in ways that should have been warning signs to everyone involved. Friends described Orlando as charismatic and fun to be around, someone who knew how to make people laugh and enjoy themselves. But beneath that charm was a growing obsession with Haley that became more apparent as time went on. The situation reached a disturbing turning point when Haley's tires were slashed. It happened the day after a party at Orlando's apartment, where he learned that Haley and Kevin were back together. When Haley walked Kevin out to his car the next morning, they discovered the damage. Kevin immediately suspected Orlando, and so did Haley's mother Karen when she heard about the incident. The damage was significant, over $600 worth, which would have made it a felony charge. Despite pressure from her family to file a police report and press charges, Haley refused. She was concerned that a felony conviction would get Orlando kicked out of the nursing program. This decision perfectly illustrated Haley's compassionate nature, but it also demonstrated how Orlando had manipulated her feelings of guilt and sympathy. Friends later revealed that Orlando would often make statements about wanting to harm himself, using emotional manipulation to keep Haley involved in his life even when she tried to distance herself. Despite the tire-slashing incident and the warnings from friends and family, Haley eventually allowed Orlando back into her life. Her trusting nature and genuine care for others made it difficult for her to completely cut ties with someone she had once cared about. The months following the tire incident were marked by this same pattern of Orlando's concerning behavior, followed by Haley's reluctant forgiveness. Her friends watched with growing alarm as the cycle continued, but Haley remained convinced that she could handle the situation. None of them could have predicted how deadly that situation would become. As March 2018 arrived, Haley was focused on her final semester and upcoming graduation. She had been spending time with her roommates, enjoying normal college activities like playing board games and sharing wine on quiet evenings. These were the moments that would later take on profound significance as the last peaceful memories her friends had of her. On the evening of March 7th, Haley had what would be her final normal night with her roommates. They stayed up late together, talking and laughing as college friends do. When they went to bed that night, none of them realized it would be the last time they would see Haley alive. The next morning brought an eerie silence that her roommates initially dismissed. Haley loved to sleep in, so when she didn't respond to text messages right away, no one was immediately concerned. College students often have irregular schedules, and it wasn't unusual for someone to be unreachable for a few hours. But as March 8th wore on with no word from Haley, that initial lack of concern began transforming into genuine worry. By Thursday, March 8th, when Haley failed to show up at poetry night, where she had promised to watch her friend perform, the concern among her circle intensified dramatically. Multiple attempts to reach her by phone went unanswered, which was completely out of character for someone who stayed in constant communication with her friends and family. Her roommates began piecing together the timeline of the previous evening, trying to understand when they had last seen or heard from Haley. The realization that she had been missing for over 24 hours without any contact sent alarm bells ringing through their tight-knit group. Meanwhile, back in Westbury, Karen Anderson remained unaware that anything was wrong. She and Haley had an agreement that they would talk every Sunday, respecting her daughter's independence while maintaining their close relationship. It was still early in the week, so Karen had no reason to suspect that her daughter was in danger. The breakthrough in locating Haley came through modern technology and the quick thinking of her roommates. One of them remembered that Haley had shared her location through the Find My Friends app on her phone. When they checked the app, it showed that Haley's phone was at Orlando's apartment. This discovery shifted the search from a general missing person case to a focused investigation at a specific location. The roommates made the decision to go to Orlando's apartment and see if they could find their friend. When they arrived at the house where Orlando lived, they knocked on all the doors, but received no response. Orlando's car was also missing from the property, which seemed to confirm that no one was home. However, the fact that Haley's phone was showing as being inside the apartment created an urgent need to investigate further. Faced with locked doors and growing fear for their friend's safety, the roommates made the difficult decision to climb through a window to gain entry to the apartment. This wasn't a decision they made lightly, but their concern for Haley outweighed their reservations about entering someone else's home without permission. What they discovered inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The roommate who entered first immediately screamed for the others to call 911. In Orlando's bedroom, they found Haley's lifeless body. She appeared pale and motionless, and even though they hoped against hope that she might still be alive, it was clear that something terrible had happened. The police response was immediate and comprehensive. Within minutes of the 911 call, the house was swarming with officers, investigators, and medical personnel. The scene quickly transformed from a college rental house into an active crime scene. Initial examination revealed that Haley had been strangled to death. The position of her body and the condition of the room suggested that the attack had been intimate and personal. There were no signs of forced entry or robbery, pointing toward someone she knew and trusted. Most significantly, Orlando was nowhere to be found. As investigators began processing the crime scene, they discovered a wealth of evidence that would help them piece together the timeline of events. The house was equipped with multiple security cameras that had captured movements both inside and outside the property. The camera footage revealed a chilling sequence of events that began in the early morning hours of March 8th. The first significant recording showed Haley and Orlando walking into the residence together. This would be the last time Haley was seen alive on any recording. After entering the apartment with Haley, Orlando was captured on camera leaving the residence multiple times over the following hours. However, Haley never appeared on any subsequent footage, suggesting that she never left the apartment after their initial arrival together. The timeline established by the security cameras painted a disturbing picture of Orlando's activities in the hours following Haley's death, rather than immediately calling for help or reporting what had happened. He appeared to be methodically planning his next moves. Investigators tracked Orlando's movements through various pieces of evidence found in his apartment. A receipt led them to a local pharmacy where security footage showed him purchasing sleeping aids, including Zizquil and melatonin. This purchase occurred several hours after Haley's estimated time of death, suggesting he was attempting to cope with what he had done or prepare for his own suicide. The evidence suggested that Orlando returned to his apartment after the pharmacy visit and remained there for approximately 7 more hours. During this time, investigators believe he attempted to take his own life by hanging himself in the basement of the house. Physical evidence supported this theory. Officers found blood on the basement floor and a tie hanging from a doorway, along with hooks that could have been used in a suicide attempt. It appeared that Orlando had tried to hang himself but had fallen and injured himself in the process, explaining the blood evidence. Perhaps most damning was a handwritten note found in the apartment, written in Spanish. The note began with "Lamento mucho esto," which translates to "I'm really sorry about this." Orlando continued by writing that he never felt he could be capable of doing such a thing, and ended with "Father, I'll see you soon," a reference to his deceased father. This note served as both a confession and what appeared to be a suicide note, providing investigators with clear evidence of Orlando's guilt and his mental state following the crime. However, instead of following through with his apparent suicide plan, Orlando made a different choice. Approximately 16 hours before Haley's body was discovered by her roommates, security cameras captured Orlando leaving his apartment one final time, this time carrying luggage, with his head bandaged, likely from his failed suicide attempt. Orlando drove more than 3 hours to New York's JFK Airport. There, he boarded a plane that would take him back to his home country of Nicaragua, where he held dual citizenship. This flight represented Orlando's attempt to escape justice by fleeing to a country where extradition would prove complicated. His dual citizenship status meant that Nicaragua was not required to send him back to the United States to face charges, creating a potential legal nightmare for prosecutors. When District Attorney Steve Cornwell learned that Orlando had successfully fled to Nicaragua before they could arrest him, his first thought was the devastating possibility that a killer might have escaped justice permanently. The complexities of international law and extradition treaties meant that bringing Orlando back to face trial would be far from guaranteed. The case now required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, international cooperation, and navigation of complex legal frameworks that many local prosecutors rarely encounter. What had begun as a local murder investigation was about to become an international pursuit of justice. Meanwhile, the devastating news of Haley's death reached her family in the most heartbreaking way possible. Karen Anderson was at home when she noticed two men in a black car parked outside her house. When they approached her door and asked to speak with her, she knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The officers sat her down and delivered the news that no parent ever wants to hear. They told her that Haley had been found dead, that she had been strangled, and that the primary suspect had fled the country. In that moment, Karen's world completely collapsed. The guilt and regret hit her immediately. She remembered the tire slashing incident and her insistence that Haley should have pressed charges against Orlando. She wondered if her daughter would still be alive if they had taken that threat more seriously, if they had recognized the warning signs for what they truly were. The international hunt for Orlando Tercero intensified as Nicaraguan authorities worked to locate the fugitive. Within days of his flight from New York, Orlando was tracked to his hometown of Chinandega, Nicaragua, where he had been hiding with family members. The political climate in Nicaragua complicated matters, but eventually, local police apprehended him at a hospital where he was receiving treatment for his self-inflicted injuries. A dramatic press conference in Managua showcased Orlando in custody, confirming to the world that he had been captured. However, capturing him was only the beginning of what would become a prolonged legal battle spanning two countries and two very different justice systems. District Attorney Cornwell initially pushed for extradition, hoping to bring Orlando back to New York to face second-degree murder charges. For over a year, diplomatic channels worked to secure his return, but the dual citizenship issue proved insurmountable. Nicaragua's constitution prohibited extraditing its own citizens, regardless of existing treaties with the United States. In September 2019, Cornwell received the call that would change everything. The Department of Justice delivered mixed news. Nicaragua would not extradite Orlando, but they were willing to prosecute him under their own legal system. While this wasn't the outcome anyone had hoped for, it represented Haley's family's only chance at seeing some form of justice. The charges in Nicaragua were different from what Orlando would have faced in New York. Instead of second-degree murder, he was charged with femicide, a specific crime recognizing the murder of women by men with whom they had relationships. This charge carried a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison. What followed was an unprecedented legal proceeding that would test the limits of international cooperation. The entire trial was conducted through video conferencing, with witnesses testifying from the Broome County District Attorney's Office to a courtroom in Managua, thousands of miles away. Karen Anderson became the first witness, finally coming face to face with her daughter's killer through a computer screen. The technology allowed her to see Orlando's reaction as she testified about the warning signs they had all witnessed, his possessive behavior, and the devastating impact of losing Haley. One by one, Haley's friends and roommates shared their stories with the Nicaraguan court. They described Orlando's obsessive behavior, the tire-slashing incident, and his pattern of showing up uninvited at their apartment. The surveillance footage from Orlando's house was presented as evidence, showing the timeline of events that led to Haley's death. The medical examiner's testimony was particularly crucial, establishing that Haley had died from strangulation, with specific injuries consistent with manual compression of her neck. The intimate nature of the attack reinforced the prosecution's argument that this was a crime of passion committed by someone Haley knew and trusted. Orlando's defense team argued that he had been temporarily insane at the time of the murder, claiming he had no memory of the events due to alcohol consumption. They brought in a court-appointed psychiatrist who testified that Orlando claimed to have woken up after a night of heavy drinking to find Haley dead. However, this defense strategy fell apart under scrutiny. There was no evidence that Orlando had been intoxicated to the point of temporary insanity, and the deliberate nature of his actions afterwards suggested clear thinking and planning. The handwritten note he left behind demonstrated his awareness of what he had done. The trial moved swiftly by Nicaraguan standards, concluding after just a few days of testimony. When the judge returned from deliberation after only 90 minutes, everyone was surprised by the speed of the decision. The verdict was unequivocal: guilty of femicide. In her sentencing remarks, the judge delivered a powerful statement about violence against women and the importance of recognizing femicide as a serious crime. She noted that Orlando had taken it upon himself to punish Haley for rejecting him, attempting to control her through the ultimate act of violence. Orlando received the maximum sentence of 30 years in prison, a decision that brought some measure of closure to Haley's family and friends. While nothing could bring Haley back, seeing her killer held accountable provided a sense that justice had been served. The case established important precedents for international cooperation in domestic violence cases and highlighted the serious nature of femicide as a distinct crime. It also demonstrated how modern technology, from security cameras to phone tracking apps, can provide crucial evidence in solving murders. For Haley's family, the conclusion of the trial marked the end of one chapter in their grief journey, but the beginning of another focused on healing and honoring her memory. They established initiatives to raise awareness about domestic violence warning signs and the importance of taking threats seriously. Karen Anderson became an advocate for femicide legislation in the United States, hoping that Haley's story might help prevent similar tragedies. She spoke openly about the guilt she carried for not pushing harder for charges after the tire-slashing incident, hoping other families might learn from their experience. The friends who discovered Haley's body continue to carry the trauma of that day. but they also carry forward her memory through their own nursing careers and advocacy work. They remember her as the free-spirited, trusting person who saw good in everyone, even when that trust ultimately betrayed her. Orlando remains imprisoned in Nicaragua's overcrowded penitentiary system, where he will likely spend the next 3 decades. If he ever attempts to return to American soil, he still faces second-degree murder charges in New York State, ensuring that his debt to justice extends far beyond his current sentence. This case serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence warning signs should never be ignored. That obsessive behavior can escalate to deadly violence, and that the people closest to us are sometimes the ones who pose the greatest danger. Haley Anderson's story is ultimately one of a bright future stolen by someone who couldn't accept that love cannot be forced or controlled. Her legacy lives on through the lives she would have saved as a nurse, the awareness her case has raised about femicide, and the determination of those who loved her to ensure that her death has meaning beyond the senseless act that ended her life. The small town of Corning, New York, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Tree-lined streets, neighbors who knew each other's names, and the kind of community where people still left their doors unlocked at night. For Michelle Neureuther, this quiet upstate haven represented everything she wanted for her 3 daughters after years of a troubled marriage. But on a late August afternoon in 2017, that sense of safety would be shattered forever. What appeared to be a tragic suicide would soon unravel into something far more sinister. A story involving manipulation, betrayal, and an unthinkable choice that would destroy a family from within. This is the story of how a father's obsession with control led to murder, and how he convinced his own daughter to help him commit the ultimate betrayal. Michelle Neureuther had always been the kind of mother who put her children first. After her divorce from Lloyd in 2013, she'd worked hard to create a stable home for her 3 girls. The oldest had already moved out. 19-year-old Carrie was away at college in Rochester, and the youngest, just 14, was still at home navigating the complexities of high school. Those who knew Michelle described her as brilliant and determined. She held a master's degree and taught English at a local college, always encouraging her daughters to be well-spoken and educated. After years of what friends described as an controlling marriage, Michelle seemed to be finding her footing as a single mother. The divorce hadn't been easy. Lloyd, an engineer at the local Corning Glass Works, had fought tooth and nail for custody of the children. What followed was a relentless legal battle that consumed years of Michelle's life and drained her emotionally and financially. Court records would later reveal an astounding 26 separate legal filings after their divorce was finalized. 26. In most cases, divorce attorneys see maybe 2 or 3 post-divorce filings at most. But Lloyd was different. He seemed determined to use the legal system as a weapon, filing motion after motion, making false claims, and trying to get out of child support payments. Michelle's friends and family watched as this legal harassment took its toll. Every time she thought she could move forward, another court date would appear, another filing, another attempt by Lloyd to drag her back into the system that had already caused her so much pain. But then, in late August 2017, something unexpected happened. Lloyd failed to show up for a crucial court hearing regarding his petition for sole custody of their youngest daughter. For a man who had been obsessively litigious for years, this was completely out of character. He didn't withdraw his petition, didn't ask for a postponement, didn't even answer the court's calls or emails. Michelle's attorney was shocked. This was the same man who had filed motion after motion for years, and now he simply didn't show up. It was unthinkable, especially given his pattern of behavior. When the case was dismissed due to his no-show, Michelle felt something she hadn't experienced in years: relief. For the first time since their bitter divorce, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, Lloyd was finally ready to move on. That weekend, Michelle seemed happier than she had been in months. Friends would later remember seeing her and her youngest daughter sliding down grassy hills on blocks of ice, laughing and enjoying the simple pleasure of a summer day together. It was the kind of carefree moment that had been rare during the years of legal battles, but that joy would be short-lived. On Monday, August 28th, a family friend arrived at Michelle's house to pick up her 14-year-old daughter for swim practice. When no one answered the door, concern quickly turned to alarm. Through the glass panels of the front door, the friend could see something was terribly wrong. Sergeant John McDivitt was the first police officer to respond to the scene that afternoon. What he found would haunt him for years to come. Michelle Neurouter was lying at the bottom of her staircase, a rope around her neck. She was cold and stiff to the touch, clearly having been dead for hours. At first glance, it appeared to be a suicide by hanging. But as McDivitt and other investigators examined the scene more closely, things didn't add up. There was an unusual ligature mark on Michelle's chin that didn't match the pattern they would expect to see in a typical hanging. It looked as though someone had gone behind her, thrown a rope over her neck, and pulled back and down. Even more concerning was the fact that Michelle's youngest daughter, the one who was supposed to be picked up for swim practice, was nowhere to be found. In a case that already seemed suspicious, a missing child raised the stakes dramatically. Police Chief Jeff Spaulding arrived on scene and immediately shared McDivitt's concerns. The physical evidence didn't match what they would expect to see in a suicide. The positioning of the body, the ligature marks, the rope itself. All of it seemed wrong somehow. As officers searched the house from top to bottom, checking basements, attics, and garages, the hours ticked by with no sign of the missing teenager. The possible outcomes were all terrifying to contemplate. Then, late that evening, the phone rang at the police station. It was Carrie, Michelle's 19-year-old daughter, calling from Rochester, nearly 100 miles away. She had devastating news to share, but also brought relief to the frantic search efforts. The 14-year-old was safe. She was with Carrie in Rochester, nearly 100 miles from the crime scene. But Carrie's explanation of how they ended up there would be the first of many stories that didn't quite make sense. She claimed that she had driven back to Corning late Saturday night to spend one last night in her childhood bedroom before the school semester began. According to Carrie, Michelle had become enraged at her, accusing her of taking Lloyd's side in their ongoing custody battle. Carrie told police that Michelle had been screaming and carrying on, and that she became concerned for her younger sister's safety. So, she claimed, she had taken the 14-year-old outside, put her in the car, and driven back to Rochester in the middle of the night. The story seemed plausible on the surface, but it raised immediate questions for investigators. Why would Michelle be so upset on the same day she had been celebrating a major legal victory? Friends and family who knew Michelle described her as determined and resilient, not someone who would take her own life just as things were finally looking up. Her mother, Jeanne, was adamant from the moment she heard the news. Michelle would never have committed suicide. She had fought too hard for too long to give up now. She had 3 daughters who needed her, a career she loved, and finally seemed to be emerging from the shadow of her toxic marriage. But if Michelle had been murdered, who could have done it? And how? Lloyd had what appeared to be an airtight alibi. According to both him and Carrie, he had been in California for a job interview when Michelle's body was discovered. He had flown out there on Sunday morning, more than 24 hours before police found Michelle on Monday afternoon. The timeline seemed to check out, But investigators weren't ready to rule anyone out just yet. They began digging deeper into the movements of everyone involved in the days leading up to Michelle's death. What they would discover would challenge everything they thought they knew about family loyalty, manipulation, and just how far a parent might go to control their children's lives. The investigation was just beginning, but already, nothing was as it seemed. When Lloyd finally returned from California and learned of Michelle's death, his first stop wasn't to comfort his grieving daughters or make funeral arrangements. Instead, he went straight to the family court building to stop his child support and maintenance payments. For investigators, this cold calculation was their first real glimpse into Lloyd's true character. But Lloyd seemed prepared for their questions. When police caught up with him outside the courthouse, he appeared calm and composed, ready with answers that matched Carrie's story perfectly. He explained how he had helped Carrie move into her college apartment on Saturday, stayed at a nearby hotel that night, and flew out to California early Sunday morning for his job interview. The hotel security cameras seemed to back up his story. There was Lloyd, checking into the microtel on Saturday evening. There was Carrie, arriving for breakfast with her younger sister the next morning at 7 a.m. The timestamps appeared to give Lloyd an ironclad alibi, but as investigators dug deeper into the surveillance footage, cracks began to appear in what had seemed like a perfect story. The cameras showed Lloyd walking Carrie to her car that Saturday night. But then something interesting happened. Instead of returning to the hotel alone, the video showed Lloyd getting into the car with Carrie and driving off into the night. More importantly, the cameras never showed him returning to the hotel that evening. While Lloyd's cell phone had remained in his hotel room all night, pinging the local towers consistently, Lloyd himself appeared to have been somewhere else entirely. The next morning, at 6:30 a.m., the cameras captured him walking across the parking lot toward his vehicle, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. For investigators, this was the first concrete evidence that Lloyd had been lying to them. But lying about where you spent the night doesn't necessarily make you a murderer. They needed more. The motive became clearer as they examined Lloyd's financial situation. Despite his engineering job at Corning, he was drowning in debt. Over $100,000 in credit card bills, and monthly payments to Michelle of nearly $6,000 in child support and alimony. The financial pressure was mounting, and Michelle's death would solve multiple problems at once. Not only would the support payments stop, but Lloyd stood to collect on Michelle's life insurance policy, worth $260,000. For a man facing financial ruin, his ex-wife's death represented a potential windfall 2.5 months after Michelle's death, with the case still officially undetermined. Investigators decided to employ a technique known in law enforcement circles as tickling the wire. They would place wiretaps on both Lloyd and Carrie's phones, then create a situation that might prompt them to have revealing conversations. The ruse was simple. An investigator called Carrie, claiming they had additional questions and wanted to meet with her again. It was a common technique, designed to create anxiety and hopefully prompt incriminating phone calls. The strategy worked better than they could have hoped. Within minutes of hanging up with police, Carrie was on the phone with her father, clearly panicked about the request for another meeting. Lloyd's response was telling. Instead of encouraging his daughter to cooperate with the investigation, he immediately began coaching her on what to say. More suspiciously, when Carrie suggested she could easily meet with the investigator and tell the same story she had already given, Lloyd shut down the idea entirely. He instructed her to claim he had a counseling appointment back in New Jersey and couldn't make himself available. For investigators listening in, Lloyd's behavior raised an obvious question. If they were both telling the truth about Michelle's death, Why would Lloyd be so reluctant to speak with police again? Why coach Carrie on how to avoid the meeting? Innocent people typically want to help solve cases, not avoid investigators. But the wiretaps alone weren't enough to build a murder case. The district attorney needed more concrete evidence, so he took an unusual step. He asked a private forensic pathologist to take a fresh look at all the evidence from Michelle's autopsy. By this time, Lloyd had already had Michelle's body cremated, so there was no physical remains for the pathologist to examine. But using the original autopsy photos, documentation, and evidence from the scene, the expert reached a conclusion that changed everything. Michelle Neureuther had been murdered. The ligature mark on her chin, the specific pattern of hemorrhaging in her eyes, and other forensic details all pointed to one conclusion. Michelle had been strangled to death, and her body had been positioned to make it look like suicide. Armed with this new determination, investigators were ready to move. On January 24, 2018, nearly 5 months after Michelle's death, they coordinated simultaneous confrontations with both Lloyd and Carrie. 2 investigators showed up at Lloyd's office in New Jersey, while a pair of state police troopers found Carrie at her college internship in Syracuse. This was their Hail Mary pass, their chance to finally get the truth about what happened that night. The strategy of separating them proved crucial. When investigators told Lloyd that the medical examiner had ruled Michelle's death a homicide, he maintained his innocence. He even agreed to take a polygraph test, seeming confident in his ability to pass. But 200 miles away in Syracuse, Carrie was having a very different reaction to the news. Away from her father's influence for the first time since the murder, the psychological pressure finally became too much to bear. In barely a whisper, 19-year-old Carrie began to tell investigators what really happened on the night her mother died. Her father had come to Michelle's house with her that night, and she had helped him get inside undetected. According to Carrie's confession, Lloyd had approached her with an unthinkable proposition just 1 week before the murder. He claimed he was facing financial ruin and couldn't afford to keep paying Michelle. He presented his daughter with what he framed as an impossible choice. He could kill himself, leaving Carrie and her sisters orphaned and without financial support. Or there was what he called Plan B. He would kill Michelle instead, making it look like suicide, and the family's problems would be solved. For a 19-year-old who had been subjected to years of her father's manipulation and control, the choice seemed real. In her mind, she wasn't choosing between her parents' lives. She was choosing between losing one parent or losing both. The confession revealed the horrific details of that night. Carrie had driven back to Corning, not to spend a night in her childhood bedroom as she had originally claimed, but to help her father commit murder. She had brought him into the house through the front door, while her younger sister slept in the living room. Lloyd went upstairs to confront Michelle in her bedroom. At first, there was arguing. Michelle was confused and frightened, demanding to know why her ex-husband was in her home in the middle of the night. Then, according to Carrie, it suddenly got very quiet. When Carrie saw her father again, her mother was dead. But the confession revealed something even more disturbing. Carrie hadn't just helped Lloyd get into the house. She had helped him stage the suicide scene, moving Michelle's body and positioning the rope to make it look like she had taken her own life. The psychological manipulation that had led to this moment had been years in the making. What experts would later identify as parental alienation had systematically turned Carrie against her mother, making Michelle seem like the enemy rather than the victim. As investigators prepared to arrest Lloyd, they discovered he had vanished. The confident man who had agreed to take a polygraph test had disappeared rather than face the consequences of his actions. They tracked his cell phone to downtown Princeton, New Jersey, where they found him on the roof of a municipal parking garage. When officers moved in to arrest him, Lloyd bolted to the edge of the 5-story structure and threatened to jump. For 2 hours, he kept police at bay, teetering on the edge of the building as negotiators tried to talk him down. In the end, it took a tackle from a New Jersey state trooper to bring him safely into custody. The man who had orchestrated his ex-wife's murder and manipulated his own daughter into helping him was finally under arrest. But the most difficult questions were still ahead. How had a father convinced his child to help him kill her mother? And what price should Carrie pay for her role in such an unthinkable crime? The confession that Carrie gave to investigators that day would haunt everyone who heard it. Here was a 19-year-old college student describing in clinical detail how she had helped her father murder her mother. The psychological manipulation that had led to this moment was staggering in its scope and devastation. District Attorney Brooks Baker knew he was dealing with something unprecedented. In 30 years of prosecuting cases, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The level of control that Lloyd had exercised over his daughter, the systematic way he had turned her against her mother, represented what experts call parental alienation taken to its most extreme conclusion. Carrie's cooperation with the investigation became crucial to building the case against Lloyd. But her confession also revealed the depth of her own involvement. She hadn't just opened a door for her father. She had actively participated in staging Michelle's death to look like suicide, moving her mother's body and helping position the rope. The forensic evidence began to make sense once investigators understood what had really happened. Lloyd's DNA was found on Michelle's clothing, the pajamas she was wearing the night she was murdered. The unusual ligature mark on her chin now had an explanation. The positioning of her body at the bottom of the stairs suddenly fit the narrative of a staged crime scene. When Lloyd was finally captured after his dramatic standoff on the parking garage, prosecutors offered him a plea deal. He could admit his guilt and face 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole. Or he could go to trial and risk life without parole if convicted. Lloyd chose to plead guilty. But even in his confession, he couldn't resist blaming Michelle one final time. He told the judge he killed his ex-wife because he believed she might hurt their children. It was a final act of manipulation, an attempt to portray himself as a protective father rather than a calculating murderer. The judge saw through it immediately. Lloyd Neureuther was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At age 45, he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, never again able to manipulate or control anyone. But what about Carrie? The young woman who had been so thoroughly manipulated that she helped kill her own mother. Her case presented an almost impossible moral and legal question. How do you punish someone who was both perpetrator and victim? Michelle's mother, Jeanne, struggled with this question more than anyone. She had lost her daughter, but she also understood that Carrie had been psychologically destroyed by years of manipulation. In a letter to the court, she wrote that she didn't believe Michelle would want her daughter to spend decades in prison. The judge agreed. Carrie was allowed to plead guilty to second-degree manslaughter rather than murder. She was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in state prison, a remarkably lenient sentence that reflected the court's recognition of the extraordinary circumstances. Carrie was released on parole on January 16, 2020, after serving just over a year behind bars. She disappeared from public view, presumably trying to rebuild a life shattered by her father's manipulation and her own terrible choices. The case left everyone involved grappling with profound questions about family, manipulation, and justice. How does a parent convince their child to commit such an unthinkable act? How do you assign blame when the lines between victim and perpetrator become so blurred? Michelle Neurouter's death represents more than just another domestic violence case. It's a cautionary tale about the devastating power of psychological manipulation and the lengths to which some people will go to maintain control over others. Today, Lloyd remains in prison. His dreams of financial freedom and continued control over his family's lives reduced to the confines of a cell. His daughters must live with the knowledge that their father murdered their mother and convinced one of them to help. In the end, Michelle's fight for her children's well-being continued even after her death, as the truth of what happened that night finally came to light. The woman who had spent years trying to protect her daughters from their father's manipulation had become his final victim. But her story would serve as a warning about the deadly consequences of unchecked control and abuse. The small town of Corning, New York, where neighbors once felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, learned that the greatest dangers sometimes come from within our own families. And somewhere, a young woman tries to live with the choices she made on one terrible night, when a father's manipulation led to a mother's death and a family's destruction. In 1979, on what seemed like a perfect summer evening, a 9-year-old girl's life changed forever. One moment she was watching television and laughing at a comedy show. The next, she was learning that someone wanted her entire family dead. This is the story of the Busby family, whose year of terror began with a single shotgun blast that shattered more than just a car window. It destroyed their sense of safety, their home, and forced them into a life they never imagined possible. Picture this. It's August 31st, 1979, the Friday before Labor Day weekend. The Busby family is spending their evening in the driveway, painting a car while the summer sun sets over Cape Cod. 9-year-old Silen Busby has no idea this will be the last normal moment of her childhood. Her father, John Busby, is getting ready for his midnight shift as a police sergeant in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Everything seems ordinary, peaceful even, but in small towns like Falmouth, ordinary can become extraordinary in the span of a heartbeat. And sometimes, that heartbeat stops altogether. John Busby wasn't just any police officer. He was the kind of cop who didn't care about your connections, your family name, or how much money you had. If you broke the law, you faced the consequences, period. This unwavering commitment to justice had earned him respect from honest citizens and hatred from those who thought they were above the law. Unfortunately for the Busby family, one of those people had decided that John Busby needed to be silenced permanently. As John drove to work that night, less than half a mile from his house, a car pulled up behind him. At first, it seemed like any other vehicle on the road, but then it pulled alongside his Volkswagen, matching his speed. In that moment, John realized this wasn't a normal traffic situation. Someone was hunting him. The blast from the shotgun tore through the driver's side window with devastating force. The impact ripped through John's face, destroying his lower jaw and leaving him barely conscious. But in those crucial seconds before darkness took hold, he managed to do something that would save his family's lives. He wrote 2 words that would change everything, not an accident. John Busby knew instantly who wanted him dead. He'd crossed paths with dangerous people before, but one name stood out above all others. Someone who had a reputation for making problems disappear, sometimes along with the people who caused them. Someone who had been suspected in multiple disappearances and murders but had never been held accountable. Someone whose favorite saying was, "I smell smoke," which wasn't a comment about the weather, but a thinly veiled threat that your property might mysteriously catch fire. Meanwhile, back at the Busby house, 9-year-old Silen was settling in for what she thought would be a normal evening. She was watching Benny Hill on television, laughing at the comedy sketches, completely unaware that her father was fighting for his life just minutes away. Her mother, Polly, was studying to become a nurse. Her two older brothers, Eric and Sean, were probably getting ready for bed. Their cousin, Kelly, who helped with babysitting duties, was keeping an eye on things. Then came the knock at the door that shattered their world. When Silent heard someone crying or screaming, she initially thought it was coming from the television. But as the sounds continued, she realized something was terribly wrong. She came out of her room to find her father's colleague, Rick Smith, in uniform, speaking to her mother, who was crying and screaming, repeatedly saying no, 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 and trying to push him away. The confusion was overwhelming. Nobody was explaining what had happened. There was just chaos, fear, and the terrible realization that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Silent stood there, asking what was happening. But the adults were too consumed by their own shock and panic to notice her. What Silent didn't know yet was that her father was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to breathe on his own, but very much alive and very much aware of who had tried to kill him. What she also didn't know was that this shooting wasn't just about her father. It was about sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge certain people in their small town. And if those people were willing to shoot a police officer, they certainly wouldn't hesitate to finish the job by eliminating his family. The note John managed to write in his hospital bed contained more than just the words, "Not an accident." He also wrote, "Polly and the kids are not safe." This wasn't the rambling of a man in shock. This was the clear, calculated warning of someone who understood exactly what kind of enemy they were dealing with. In Falmouth, Massachusetts, there was one person everyone knew you didn't cross. Melvin Rain was in the trash hauling business, which might sound harmless enough, but his methods of dealing with competition and problems were anything but ordinary. He was a convicted arsonist with a reputation for getting even with people by sneaking around at night and burning their property, houses, cars, businesses. If Melvin had a problem with you, something you owned might mysteriously go up in flames, but arson was just the beginning. Melvin was also suspected of murder. Not one murder, not two, but 3 separate cases where people had disappeared or turned up dead under suspicious circumstances. His own wife, Wanda, had vanished in 1971 after he claimed to have dropped her off at a bus station. She was never seen again. A teenage boy who had been dating a girl Melvin was interested in was found shot to death in a cranberry bog directly across from Melvin's house. A 17-year-old former employee who was set to testify against Melvin in a grand jury investigation got on a ferry to Martha's Vineyard but never got off. In each case, Melvin walked free. The pattern was always the same. People who crossed him or posed a threat to him seemed to disappear or meet unfortunate ends. But there was never enough evidence to charge him. Or perhaps there were people in positions of power who were too afraid to go after him. This was the man John Busby had been willing to confront when others wouldn't. This was the man who had decided that a police officer who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated needed to be eliminated. And this was the man who now posed an ongoing threat to a family that included 3 young children. Back at the hospital, doctors were working frantically to save John's life. The damage was so severe that they had never seen anything like it. His face was unrecognizable. His jaw was gone, and he couldn't speak, breathe, or eat without mechanical assistance. But he was alive, and he was determined to stay that way for one reason: his family needed him to survive so he could protect them from what was coming next. Because this story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the Busby family tried to process what had happened, the reality of their situation began to sink in. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone had specifically targeted John Busby for elimination, and that same someone would likely not be satisfied with a failed attempt. The police response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the shooting, the Busby house was surrounded by law enforcement. Squad cars filled the driveway. Officers with rifles took positions around the property. The message was clear. This family was now under siege, and everyone understood that the danger was far from over. For 9-year-old Silen, the transformation was jarring. One day, she was a normal kid living in a normal house on Cape Cod. The next day, armed guards were stationed outside her bedroom window. Police officers followed her to school, sat outside her classroom, and watched her eat lunch. Every movement was monitored. Every person who came near her was scrutinized. The psychological impact on the children was immediate and profound. At school, word spread quickly about what had happened. Some children were curious, others were frightened, and many were simply told by their parents to stay away from the Busby kids. Silen found herself sitting alone at lunch tables, excluded from playground games, and treated like a walking target. One particularly cruel classmate even told her directly that everyone knew someone was trying to kill her family and that they might be next. The family's home became a fortress. An 8-foot fence was erected around the property. A sophisticated alarm system was installed. Windows were covered. Doors remained locked at all times. The family dog, Tiger, was given away and replaced with Max, a trained attack dog whose sole purpose was to eliminate any threat to John Busby or his family. Max wasn't a pet. He was a weapon with 4 legs and a set of teeth designed to kill. But perhaps the most unsettling change was in John himself. When he finally came home from the hospital months later, he was a different person entirely. The injuries to his face were so severe that he was barely recognizable. His jaw had been reconstructed, but the damage went far beyond the physical. The man who had once been playful and affectionate with his children now seemed emotionally distant. The father who used to roughhouse and tell jokes had been replaced by someone who was constantly vigilant, always watching, always planning. The financial burden on the family was crushing. John's compensation for being shot in the line of duty was $200 per week, hardly enough to support a family of 5, let alone a family that needed round-the-clock security. The town of Falmouth was spending enormous amounts of money on police protection, and it was becoming clear that this arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. Meanwhile, the investigation into the shooting was going nowhere. Despite John's clear indication of who was responsible, despite the obvious motive, and despite Melvin Rain's history of violence, no arrests were made, no charges were filed, no justice was served. It was as if the shooting had never happened, at least from an official standpoint. This lack of action wasn't just frustrating, it was terrifying. If the police couldn't or wouldn't go after the person who had tried to murder one of their own officers, what protection could they really offer his family? The Busbys were living in a state of constant fear, never knowing when the next attempt on their lives might come. John's anger was building to dangerous levels. In his hospital bed, he had initially focused on survival and recovery. But as the months passed and it became clear that no official justice would be forthcoming, his thoughts turned to a different kind of solution. He began to contemplate taking matters into his own hands. The idea of hunting down Melvin Rain and finishing what had been started that night in August became more than just a fantasy. It became a plan. The family was trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. They couldn't live normally because of the constant threat. They couldn't rely on the justice system because it had failed them completely. They couldn't even trust their own community because too many people were either afraid of Melvin Rain or somehow connected to him. As winter turned to spring and spring turned to summer, it became increasingly clear that something had to change. The Busby family couldn't continue living as prisoners in their own home. The town couldn't continue spending money on protection that might not even be effective. And John couldn't continue to heal, physically or emotionally, while surrounded by daily reminders of the violence that had been done to him. The solution, when it finally came, was as drastic as it was necessary. If the Busby family couldn't be safe in Falmouth, Massachusetts, then they would have to leave Falmouth, Massachusetts, not just for a vacation or a temporary relocation, but permanently. They would have to disappear completely, leaving behind everything they had ever known and starting over somewhere new, somewhere safe, somewhere that Melvin Rain couldn't find them. But leaving meant more than just packing their belongings and driving away. It meant abandoning their identities, their history, their connections to the community where they had lived their entire lives. It meant the children would have to learn to lie about their past, create false stories about why they had moved, and never speak the truth about what had happened to their father. Most importantly, it meant that John Busby would have to make a choice. He could stay and pursue the violent revenge that was consuming his thoughts, or he could prioritize his family's safety and disappear with them into whatever new life awaited them far from Cape Cod. The decision would define not just the next chapter of their story, but the rest of their lives. In the end, the choice was made for them. The town of Falmouth, faced with mounting security costs and no resolution in sight, made it clear that the easiest solution was for the Busby family to simply disappear, rather than continue the expensive protection detail or pursue justice against the person responsible. It was more convenient for everyone involved if the victims just went away. The message was unmistakable. It's easier for you to live somewhere else than to live here. We'll save money, and you'll be on your way. After everything John had sacrificed in service to his community, after taking a shotgun blast to the face in the line of duty, this was his reward. The town that he had protected was essentially telling him that his family's safety was less important than their budget. So in the summer of 1980, almost exactly 1 year after the shooting, the Busby family began their exodus from Cape Cod. They loaded their belongings into a car and started driving south, with no clear destination except somewhere safe. They had pulled the names of towns out of a hat, places where Polly might find work as a nurse, and Tennessee had won the lottery of their desperation. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. They were given a police escort to the Bourne Bridge, the boundary that separates Cape Cod from the mainland. It was both a gesture of respect and a clear message, goodbye and good riddance. You're not our problem anymore, as they crossed that bridge, leaving behind everything they had ever known. The children understood that they weren't just moving to a new town. They were entering a witness protection program of their own design, one where they would have to reinvent themselves completely. The people they had been, the Busby family of Falmouth, Massachusetts, were disappearing forever. The drive south felt like descending into hell. As they traveled further from the familiar coastline of Cape Cod, the temperature rose and the landscape became increasingly foreign. For children who had grown up with ocean breezes and familiar neighborhoods, the rural expanses of the American South felt like exile to another planet. When they finally reached their destination in Tennessee, the culture shock was immediate and overwhelming. Everything was different. The accents, the food, the social customs, even the way people looked at strangers. The Busby children, with their New England sensibilities and traumatic baggage, stood out like beacons in their new community. But standing out was exactly what they couldn't afford to do. So they began the painful process of transformation. Silen got a perm and started practicing a Southern accent. She learned to apply lip gloss and dress like the local girls. Most importantly, she learned to lie about their past, about why they had moved, about what was wrong with her father's face, about everything that mattered. John grew a massive beard that obscured most of the damage to his face. He found work on a farm, spending his days splitting wood and doing physical labor that seemed to help process some of his rage. The repetitive motion of swinging an axe through logs became a form of therapy, a way to channel the violence that still simmered inside him. For a while, it seemed like the healing might actually work. The family began to find their rhythm in this new place. The constant fear that had defined their existence in Massachusetts gradually faded. The children started making friends. Polly found work as a nurse. They were still looking over their shoulders, still careful about who they trusted. But life began to feel somewhat normal again. But John's anger hadn't disappeared. It had just gone underground. Every few months, he would have to return to Boston for reconstructive surgery, and each trip forced him to confront what had been done to him. When he shaved his beard for these procedures, he would see the full extent of his injuries in the mirror, and the rage would come flooding back. During one of these trips, his uncle presented him with a gift, a rifle with a scope and a silencer, everything he would need to hunt down Melvin Rain and finish what had been started that night in 1979. For a moment, John was tempted. The weapon represented everything he had dreamed about during those dark months of recovery. But something had changed. The man who had once fantasized about revenge had been replaced by someone who understood that his family's peace was worth more than his personal vengeance. He looked at the gun, wrote a note to his uncle, and walked away. "Thank you for your effort," he wrote. "I won't need it." That decision marked a turning point. When John returned to Tennessee, he told his family he was done with surgery, done with trips to Boston, done with living in the past. They were going to embrace their new life and move forward as the people they had become, not the people they used to be. Years passed. The children grew up, went to college, started families of their own. The trauma never fully disappeared, but it became manageable. The family had survived not just the original attack, but the year of terror that followed and the complete upheaval of their lives. Then, in 2003, 24 years after the shooting, something unexpected happened. The Rain family had started turning on each other, fighting over money and spilling family secrets to the police. John Rain, Melvin's brother, finally came clean about what had happened that night in August 1979. The confession provided the vindication that John Busby had been seeking for more than 2 decades. His instincts had been correct. Melvin Rain had indeed been the one who ordered the hit. John Rain described how his brother had sat in the back seat of their car with a ski mask and a shotgun, waiting for the perfect moment to fire through John's window. But vindication came with a bitter irony. By the time the confession was made, the statute of limitations had expired. No charges could be filed. No justice could be served through the legal system. Melvin Rain would never face trial for attempted murder. In a way, though, justice had been served by other means. Melvin Rain was confined to a state institution, suffering from what was reported to be Pick's disease, a form of dementia that affects the brain. The man who had once terrorized an entire community was now powerless, his mind deteriorating, his capacity for violence neutralized by his own failing health. For the Busby family, the confession brought closure of a different kind. They had built new lives far from Cape Cod. lives that were fuller and richer than what they had left behind. Ceylin became a successful author, writing books for children and drawing on her experiences to help others understand resilience and survival. John and Polly found peace in their rural Tennessee home, surrounded by the natural beauty that had helped heal their wounds. The year they disappeared had ended, but the people they became in its aftermath had endured. They had proven that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding ways to thrive despite the worst that life can throw at you. They had learned that sometimes running away isn't cowardice. It's the bravest thing you can do to protect the people you love. Looking back, Ceylin would say that she couldn't imagine being anyone other than who that terrible year had made her. The trauma had touched every part of her life, but it had also given her strength, perspective, and an appreciation for safety and normalcy that most people never develop. She had lived through something that should have destroyed her family, and instead, it had ultimately made them stronger. The Busby family's story is a testament to the power of choosing life over revenge, healing over hatred, and love over fear. They disappeared from one life and created another, proving that sometimes the best way to defeat your enemies is simply to refuse to let them define your future. In the end, they had won, not through violence or legal justice, but through the simple act of surviving and building something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The year they disappeared had become the foundation for decades of peace, love, and happiness that followed. And perhaps that's the most powerful victory of all. When Americans think of tropical paradise, they picture crystal clear waters, swaying palm trees, and endless possibilities for a fresh start. But sometimes what looks like paradise on the surface can hide something much darker underneath. Today, we're diving into a case that shocked investigators across 2 countries and revealed just how far someone will go to cover up the truth. This is the story of Devil's Island, where the American dream turned into an unimaginable nightmare. In the autumn of 2011, a young American couple arrived on the remote Caribbean islands of Panama with hopes of starting their new life together. Yvonne Baldelli, recently divorced and looking for adventure, had fallen head over heels for Brian Bermager, a decorated former Marine who seemed to have everything going for him. Brian had served 7 years in the Marine Corps, stationed in Washington, D.C., as part of the Honor Guard. There were even photographs of him standing in the White House alongside President George W. Bush. From the outside looking in, this guy had the perfect all-American persona that would make any woman's heart skip a beat. After completing his military service, Brian decided he needed to decompress and find his next chapter. Panama seemed like the ideal place to do exactly that. The cost of living was incredibly low, the beaches were pristine, and for someone with musical aspirations like Brian, the local bar scene offered plenty of opportunities to perform. Yvonne was absolutely smitten with this man. She saw him as her Prince Charming, the person she'd been waiting for her entire life. When Brian suggested they pack up everything and move to Panama together, she didn't hesitate for a second. Michelle Valenzuela, Yvonne's sister, watched as her sibling threw herself completely into this relationship. Yvonne was the type of person who gave 100% of herself when she fell in love, and she expected that same level of commitment in return. But Michelle had her reservations about Brian from the very beginning, despite her concerns. Yvonne was determined to make this work. She brought 2 sewing machines with her to Panama, planning to start a clothing business making bathing suits for tourists. With her beloved dog, Georgia May, by her side, she was ready to build the life she'd always dreamed of. The couple settled on Isla Carnero in Bocas del Toro, a small island community where expats from around the world came to escape their old lives. They rented a house right on the water, and Brian quickly became a fixture at the local bars, playing guitar and singing for food and drinks. At first, everything seemed perfect. Yvonne sent regular emails home to her family, painting a picture of tropical bliss. She described their morning runs on the beach, swimming in the crystal-clear ocean, and the excitement of building something new together in paradise. The local expat community welcomed them with open arms. Bar owners let Brian perform in exchange for meals and free alcohol. Yvonne seemed genuinely happy, and to anyone watching from the outside, they looked like a couple living their best life. But beneath the surface, cracks were already starting to show. Brian's drinking was becoming more and more problematic. What started as a few beers after performances turned into heavy drinking sessions that lasted well into the night. Some locals noticed that his musical abilities seemed to deteriorate the more he drank, describing his intoxicated singing voice as resembling a hound dog on a porch. More concerning were the signs of trouble in paradise that some observant neighbors began to notice. There were reports of loud arguments coming from their house, and on at least one occasion, locals saw bruises on Yvonne's face that she tried desperately to hide. Despite these warning signs, Yvonne's family back in the United States remained optimistic about the relationship. Her emails continued to arrive regularly, filled with stories of their tropical adventures. Her father, Jim Faust, could picture every detail of their new life based on her vivid descriptions. He genuinely believed that Brian might be the one for his daughter. But then, around Thanksgiving 2011, something changed. The frequent, cheerful emails from Yvonne began to slow down. Michelle noticed immediately that the communication pattern had shifted, and her sisterly instincts started kicking in. Days turned into weeks, and still no word from Yvonne. Finally, on December 14th, Michelle received a text message from an unknown number. It wasn't from Yvonne at all, but from Brian, asking to make arrangements to pick up his truck that he'd left at Michelle's house in California. When Michelle called the number, Brian calmly explained that he and Yvonne were no longer together. He claimed they'd gotten into a fight because she'd discovered he had a child from a previous relationship, something he'd never mentioned before. According to Brian, Yvonne had simply packed up and left without a word. This revelation was devastating for Yvonne, who was unable to have children due to a medical condition. Learning that the man she'd sacrificed everything for had been hiding the existence of his own child would have been absolutely earth-shattering. But Michelle wasn't buying Brian's story. When she suggested they go to the police together to file a missing persons report, since he was the last person to see Yvonne, Brian seemed reluctant to get involved. That's when Michelle decided to dig deeper into her email account, where she discovered a message she'd previously overlooked. It was from Yvonne herself, sent shortly after Brian's call, explaining that she and Brian had broken up and that she was headed to Costa Rica with a man she'd met when they first arrived in Panama. The email described Brian as a lying, cheating individual and claimed that Yvonne should have trusted her instincts about him from the beginning. While the message provided some explanation for what had happened, something about it didn't sit right with Michelle. The timing seemed off, and certain phrases in the email just didn't sound like something her sister would say. Yvonne had never been the type to run off impulsively with someone she barely knew, especially after such a traumatic discovery about Brian's secret child. 3 weeks later, another email arrived from Yvonne, this time saying she was getting homesick and making plans to return home by the second week of January. She mentioned she'd been staying with someone and was looking forward to seeing everyone again. This second email provided some comfort to the family, who assumed Yvonne would show up at their planned family gathering in January. But when that reunion came and went without any sign of Yvonne, Michelle knew something was terribly wrong. Her father, Jim, shared her concerns. After decades of knowing his daughter, he was certain that Yvonne would never simply disappear without maintaining contact with her family. She was too responsible, too caring, and too connected to the people she loved to just vanish into thin air. That's when Michelle decided to take matters into her own hands and investigate further. She reached out to a tech-savvy cousin who could trace the IP addresses of the emails supposedly sent by Yvonne from Panama and Costa Rica. What they discovered would change everything and set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose the dark truth about what really happened on Devil's Island. The cousin's investigation revealed something that sent chills down Michelle's spine. The emails that were supposedly sent from Panama showed IP addresses consistent with that location. But the email claiming Yvonne was in Costa Rica, living with another man, showed an IP address from Dana Point, California, exactly where Brian was now living. This meant that someone had been using Yvonne's email account to impersonate her, sending messages to her family from Brian's computer in the United States. The realization hit Michelle like a sledgehammer. Her sister wasn't hiding out in Costa Rica with some mysterious new boyfriend. Someone had been playing an elaborate game of deception, and that someone was Brian Brimmager. With this damning evidence in hand, Michelle knew she had to act fast. She contacted the FBI, where she met with Special Agent Andrew Masters, a seasoned investigator who immediately recognized the significance of what Michelle had uncovered. The IP address evidence was a smoking gun that proved beyond any doubt that foul play was involved. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation into Yvonne's disappearance, with Masters taking the lead. They contacted the State Department to check immigration records, which confirmed what Yvonne's family had suspected all along. There was no record of her ever leaving Panama or entering Costa Rica. Meanwhile, Yvonne's family couldn't wait for the wheels of justice to turn slowly. They decided to take matters into their own hands and travel to Panama to search for answers themselves. They connected with Don Winner, a legendary investigator and former U.S. intelligence officer who had built a reputation for solving impossible cases in Central America. Winner was known throughout Panama as the person to call when bad things happened to American citizens. He'd already helped put away 3 serial killers and had an uncanny ability to crack the most complex murder cases. When he heard Yvonne's story, he immediately knew they were dealing with something sinister. His assessment was blunt and chilling. The chances that Yvonne was running around Costa Rica with some other man were essentially zero. Winner believed they were looking at a murder case, and Brian Brimmager was their prime suspect. Back in the United States, the FBI was putting pressure on Brian, conducting surveillance and building their case. They discovered that within weeks of Yvonne's disappearance, Brian had not only returned to California, but had gotten engaged and married to Kristen Verkhoven, a woman he'd met while she was working at the White House. The timeline was shocking. Brian had proposed to Kristen just days after Yvonne disappeared in Panama. Wedding photos showed a couple that appeared blissfully happy, completely unaware of the dark secret that lurked beneath Brian's charming exterior. What made this revelation even more disturbing was that Kristen was the mother of Brian's secret child, the very discovery that had allegedly caused the final fight between Brian and Yvonne. Brian had been living a double life, maintaining relationships with 2 women simultaneously, neither fully aware of the other's existence. In Panama, Winner organized a press conference with local authorities to publicize Yvonne's disappearance and put pressure on anyone who might have information. For the first time, Panamanian police officially declared that Yvonne was the victim of foul play and named Brian Brimmager as their primary suspect. The press conference sent shockwaves around the world. Here was a decorated former Marine, someone who had served his country with honor and stood in the White House with the president, now being accused of murdering his girlfriend in a tropical paradise. As news of the case spread, witnesses began coming forward with disturbing accounts of Brian and Yvonne's relationship. Local bar owners and residents described a pattern of verbal and physical abuse that painted a very different picture from the happy couple Yvonne had portrayed in her emails home. One bar owner recalled seeing Yvonne with black eyes and bruises around her face. When asked about her injuries, she tried to hide them and refused to discuss what had happened. The revelation that Brian had been physically abusing Yvonne was devastating for her family, who had no idea she was suffering in silence. Jeff Salzman, who owned one of the local establishments where Brian performed, described him as a scary person who he didn't want to be around. The image of the clean-cut, all-American Marine was crumbling as more and more people shared their experiences with the couple. Yvonne's family organized search parties to comb through the dense jungle and swampland surrounding the island where she'd disappeared. The terrain was brutal. Thick tropical vegetation filled with spiders, snakes, and every kind of dangerous creature imaginable. The water was murky and rancid, making it nearly impossible to see anything beneath the surface, despite the challenging conditions. Volunteers joined the family in their desperate search for any trace of Yvonne. They found various items, a purse, medicine bottles, even a U.S. passport. But none belonged to Yvonne. Each discovery raised hopes only to dash them moments later. The search was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Lauren Byer, Yvonne's niece, found herself in the heartbreaking position of hoping to find her aunt, while simultaneously dreading what that discovery might look like after so much time had passed. Back in California, the FBI was closing in on Brian Brimmager. Agent Masters had obtained a warrant to search Brian's residence, where he made a crucial discovery. Sitting on a table in Brian's living room was a white Sony Vaio laptop computer, the exact same type of computer that Yvonne had taken with her to Panama. When Masters saw the laptop, he immediately suspected it belonged to Yvonne. His instincts proved correct. The computer contained a wealth of evidence that would ultimately help unravel the mystery of what happened on that remote Caribbean island. The laptop revealed Brian's internet search history, which painted a chilling picture of premeditation. In the days following Yvonne's disappearance, someone had used the computer to search for information about removing blood from mattresses and other incriminating queries that suggested someone was trying to cover up a violent crime. Perhaps most damning of all, the computer contained evidence that Brian had been using Yvonne's email account to send those fake messages to her family. The digital trail clearly showed that the emails claiming she was alive and well in Costa Rica had actually been composed and sent from Brian's residence in California. The investigation also uncovered financial records showing that Brian had been using Yvonne's debit card to withdraw money from her accounts after her disappearance. ATM surveillance footage captured him making these transactions, providing visual proof that he was accessing her finances while letting her family believe she was safe. As the evidence mounted against him, Brian Brimmager continued to maintain his innocence and live his new life as if nothing had happened. He spent his days playing golf, caring for his young daughter, and enjoying the comfortable suburban lifestyle that his new marriage provided. But the FBI wasn't about to let him escape justice. They were building an airtight case, piece by piece, that would eventually bring him to account for what investigators believed was a carefully planned and executed murder in paradise. In 2013, nearly 2 years after Yvonne had vanished without a trace, the FBI finally made their move. Special Agent Andrew Masters approached Brian Brimmager's apartment with handcuffs in hand. Ready to end this elaborate charade once and for all, when Masters knocked on the door, Brian answered and invited him inside, claiming he'd been expecting this visit. For more than 4 hours, while Brian casually babysat his young daughter, Masters grilled him about the inconsistencies in his story and the mounting evidence against him. Brian continued to stick to his original narrative. He insisted that Yvonne had left him for another man, that she'd gone to Costa Rica willingly, and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. But when confronted with the IP address evidence and the fact that her supposed emails from Costa Rica were actually sent from his computer, Brian began to stumble. The pressure was mounting, and cracks were starting to show in his carefully constructed facade. Masters could see the doubt creeping into Brian's eyes as the evidence piled up against him. But even then, this former Marine refused to break. Brian was arrested and charged with 13 felonies related to the cover-up of Yvonne's death. However, without a body, prosecutors couldn't yet bring murder charges. That would all change in the most dramatic way possible. In June 2013, a local worker clearing brush on the very island where Brian and Yvonne had lived made a discovery that would finally bring closure to this tragic case. Hidden in the dense jungle, just a few hundred yards from where Yvonne's family had spent days searching, he found a duffel bag. When the worker unbuckled the clasp and looked inside, he discovered Yvonne's skeletonized remains. After 2 years in the tropical elements, only bones remained of the vibrant young woman who had come to Panama with such hope and excitement. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. This was Yvonne Baldelli, and her remains told a horrific story of what had really happened in paradise. The autopsy revealed that she had been dismembered, most likely after being stabbed in the back at least twice. The discovery of Yvonne's body allowed prosecutors to finally bring murder charges against Brian Brimmiger. But for Michelle Valenzuela, who had fought tirelessly for justice for her sister, time was running out in her own battle for survival. Michelle had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, and doctors gave her just weeks to live. Despite her deteriorating condition, she was determined to see this case through to the end. In what would be one of her final acts of love for her sister, Michelle agreed to give crucial testimony while she still could. The courtroom scene was heartbreaking. Michelle, weakened by cancer but fueled by determination, sat directly across from Brian Brimmiger and told the world about her sister's disappearance. She pointed him out in the courtroom, identifying him as the man who had destroyed her family. The testimony was exhausting, and Michelle collapsed afterward from the strain. But she had accomplished what she set out to do. Her words would be preserved forever, ensuring that Yvonne's story would be told and that justice would prevail. Days later, Michelle passed away, having given everything she had to find the truth about what happened to her beloved sister. Meanwhile, investigators made another breakthrough that would seal Brian's fate. Remember that machete he had sold on Facebook after Yvonne's disappearance? The one he had joked about using to chop up one stripper. The FBI had tracked it down and subjected it to advanced forensic testing. While Brian had cleaned the blade thoroughly, he had missed something crucial. When investigators removed the handle, they found Yvonne's blood and DNA trapped underneath where no amount of cleaning could reach it. This was the smoking gun that proved beyond any doubt that this weapon had been used to dismember her body. Faced with this overwhelming evidence, Brian Brimmiger's house of lies finally collapsed. His lawyers advised him that fighting these charges would be futile, and in early 2016 he finally admitted defeat. In a dramatic reversal, Brian pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. After nearly 5 years of lies, manipulation, and deception. He finally admitted in open court that he had killed Yvonne Baldelli. He offered an apology to her family, but his words rang hollow after everything he had put them through. The judge sentenced Brian Brimmager to 26 years in federal prison. For a man who had once stood in the White House as an honored Marine, this was a spectacular fall from grace. He would spend the best years of his life behind bars, paying for the terrible crime he committed in paradise. With the case finally resolved, Yvonne's remains were returned to her family for a proper burial. In a touching ceremony, they laid her to rest at sea, knowing that she loved the ocean and would finally be at peace in the waters she had found so beautiful. The case of Devil's Island serves as a chilling reminder that paradise can quickly turn into hell when dangerous people are involved. Yvonne Baldelli went to Panama looking for love and adventure, but instead found herself trapped with a man capable of unthinkable violence. Brian Brimmager's ability to live multiple lives simultaneously, decorated Marine, loving husband, and cold-blooded killer, shows how easily predators can hide among us. His wife, Kristen, continues to support him and visit him in prison, apparently still believing in his innocence despite his guilty plea. The real heroes of this story are the family members who never gave up searching for the truth. Michelle Valenzuela's determination to find justice for her sister, even while battling terminal cancer, demonstrates the power of love and persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Today, Brian Brimmager sits in federal prison, where he will remain until 2037. The tropical paradise of Panama continues to attract visitors from around the world, but for those who knew Yvonne Baldelli, the islands will forever be haunted by the memory of what happened there. This case reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are hiding behind the most respectable facades. A military uniform, a charming smile, and an all-American persona can mask the darkest of intentions. And sometimes, what looks like paradise from the outside can be nothing more than Devil's Island in disguise. Shirley Seitz grew up in northern Alabama, a region known for its small churches lining the roads and the sounds of gospel music filling Sunday mornings. She was raised in a working-class, faith-driven family that valued giving over taking and encouraged living life with purpose, kindness, and passion for music. From an early age, Shirley was captivated by music and ministry. Those who knew her spoke of her as a warm, charismatic woman whose voice could inspire and comfort everyone who heard it. Her favorite hymn, Amazing Grace, was more than a song to her. It was how she approached life. She embodied the qualities of an evangelist, someone who didn't just preach the word, but lived it, demonstrating compassion and service daily. Shirley not only kept her faith, but also actively participated in pastoral activities. She traveled to churches and gatherings across the region, not as a celebrity or famous singer, but as someone who connected sincerely with others. Her storytelling brought scripture to life, and her presence in the room was unforgettable. However, Shirley's life wasn't without challenges. Despite her deep faith, she experienced difficulties, particularly in her relationships. She had been married several times, enduring the heartbreak of failed relationships that ended in disappointment or disillusionment. Nonetheless, she remained hopeful and never stopped believing in love. Her family admired her perseverance in always seeing the good in people, even when others did not see it. By the time Shirley met Michael Vollschlager, she was in her 50s. Her children were grown, and she had recently inherited a significant sum following the death of her previous husband, providing her with financial stability for the first time. While she wasn't looking for a fairy tale romance, she sought a partnership built on trust, respect, and shared faith. Michael entered her life with charm and confidence, A chiropractor by profession, he had practiced in Florida and claimed to have helped many through his work. Known as Dr. Mike, he projected an image of purpose and refinement that resonated with Shirley's values. He shared stories of past struggles and emphasized his Christian beliefs. To Shirley, who had always seen herself as a healer, Michael seemed like someone deserving of redemption, and she wanted to give him that chance. In the early days of their relationship, Shirley appeared happy. She and Michael married after just 3 months of courtship. However, her family, particularly her daughter and brothers, expressed concerns about the rapid pace of the relationship and Michael's financial instability, failed past relationships, and lack of a steady job. Despite their reservations, Shirley asked them to trust her judgment. After their marriage, Shirley and Michael moved into a small house in Loxley, South Alabama, on a street with the charming name Camelot. For Shirley, the name symbolized hope for a lifetime of happiness. She sought to create a peaceful life filled with prayer, music, and visits from loved ones. Shirley supported Michael financially in the beginning, covering expenses for their home, furniture, and vehicle, viewing these as acts of love rather than burdens. Despite their initial concerns, Shirley's family tried to welcome Michael. They joined the couple for meals, family celebrations, and holidays. Shirley's mother Myrtle, her daughter Sharon, and her brother Ricky stayed closely connected through frequent visits and calls. Shirley had always been the emotional anchor of the family, making each member feel valued and appreciated. Her family treasured this closeness and wanted to preserve it. Even after she remarried, Shirley was a steadfast presence in her community, continuing to lead worship services and provide spiritual guidance to those who turned to her. She was rarely seen in public without a smile, staying true to the principles that had always defined her: honesty, humility, and forgiveness. Her conversations with family were often filled with scripture and warm words of encouragement. Even during difficult moments or when she felt overwhelmed, she worked hard to shield those around her from her struggles. However, over time, the family began to notice small but noticeable changes in Shirley. Her voice, once strong and self-assured, began to waver. Her energy seemed drained, and she spoke differently about her life at home. Although she never directly criticized her husband, small comments hinted at financial pressures or emotional fatigue. True to her nature, Shirley kept most of her worries to herself, not wanting to burden others. To her family, she still seemed like a woman determined to make her relationship work. A woman holding on to faith in love, despite having gone through 4 previous marriages. She still gives her time, resources, faith, and trust to others. Yet, none of them could have foreseen the storm ahead. Even as doubt began to creep into their minds, they had no way of imagining the tragedy that would soon unfold. On the surface, Shirley and Michael appear to be an ordinary couple, living peacefully in a small town in Alabama. However, behind the closed doors, tensions were escalating, slowly at first. Then, with alarming intensity, Shirley's family began feeling uneasy after her marriage to Michael. Their concerns weren't based on mere suspicion, but on clear changes they observed. Shirley, once vibrant with joy and spiritual energy, seemed to be retreating from her old self. Her phone calls became less frequent. She stopped visiting her family as frequently, and her daughter Sharon noticed how she avoided questions about Michael and their finances. Unbeknownst to her family, Shirley had been almost entirely supporting Michael. He had no steady job or reliable source of income, yet his financial demands continued to grow. Shirley used the life insurance money from her late husband to sustain their life together, paying for their home, buying him a truck, and helping him with overdue bills. What began as generosity on Shirley's part eventually turned into an expectation. And finally, an obligation. As the financial strain increased, emotional distance followed. Michael began pressuring Shirley for more money, and while she initially resisted quietly, her unease began to show. In conversations with her daughter and mother, she cautiously shared her concerns. In a phone call, she mentioned that Michael was very upset when she brought up the bills. However, her reluctance to elaborate left her family unaware of the full extent of the trouble. The last time Shirley was seen alive was March 21, 2010. That night, during their conversation, she told her daughter Sharon that she loved her, without any urgency. The following day, she stopped answering her phone, which was unlike her. Sharon grew anxious. Her mother never went silent without reason. When Ricky, Shirley's brother, went to her house to check on her, Michael met him outside, calm and composed. Michael claimed Shirley had left with a friend for a spiritual retreat, but something felt wrong. The house was unnervingly quiet. Shirley's purse and phone were inside. Her car was still in the driveway, and Michael, while outwardly calm, showed no genuine concern. Alarmed, the family reported Shirley missing within hours. The Loxley Police Department launched an investigation. Officers searched the house, the nearby woods, and pressed Michael for answers. His story quickly unraveled. Initially, he said Shirley had gone out alone. Later, he claimed she had left with someone from church, but he couldn't name anyone or explain why her belongings had been left behind. The inconsistencies raised suspicion, and investigators began digging into Michael's background. What they uncovered painted a disturbing picture. Michael had a history of deception and exploitation. Court records revealed a string of failed relationships, financial troubles, and manipulative behavior. His past wives had accused him of fraud, emotional abuse, and even making threats. Shirley seemed to have fallen for his charm, only to end up as the latest victim in a disturbing pattern. As the investigation escalated, police used cadaver dogs to search the property. On March 24th, 3 days after Shirley vanished, the dogs led officers to a shallow grave behind her and Michael's home. Upon digging, investigators unearthed a tarp. Beneath it, wrapped tightly in layers of plastic, lay the body of Shirley. Her face had been covered in duct tape, and her body showed signs of restraint. The autopsy concluded that her death was caused by asphyxiation. This was no accident. It was intentional. The crime scene revealed a chilling story. Shirley's disappearance wasn't straightforward. She was murdered in her own home, likely on the night she last spoke with her daughter. Her body was buried just feet from the house where she had once sung gospel hymns and prayed for peace. Michael was arrested immediately. During his initial interview, he denied any involvement. He claimed ignorance, suggested someone else was responsible, and argued he was being framed. However, the evidence told a different story. Investigators uncovered signs of a struggle inside the home. Blood found in the bedroom and hallway matched Shirley's. The duct tape discovered on her face was identical to a roll found in the garage. Cell phone records placed Michael near the burial site in the early morning hours following her disappearance. Further investigation revealed a motive. Shirley had recently confronted Michael about financial issues. She had begun to assert herself, talking about cutting off money and needing space. Michael, fearing the loss of his home, truck, and financial security, snapped. Police believed greed drove him. He had grown accustomed to the comforts Shirley's generosity provided. When she started resisting, he saw no way forward except to eliminate her. The arrest left the small town in shock. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries with Michael now spoke to reporters. Church friends wept. Shirley, a woman known for her kindness and service, had been killed by the very man she tried to love and support. In the aftermath, more of Shirley's loved ones came forward. Some recalled seeing unexplained bruises she dismissed. Others mentioned that they had heard her say she didn't want to fight anymore, but had assumed she was referring to verbal arguments. No one had imagined it would escalate to that. The district attorney acted swiftly, assembling a case that painted Michael as calculating and manipulative. They gathered digital evidence, financial records, and statements from his former spouses. A disturbing pattern emerged: a man who used charm, faith, and emotional neediness to exploit vulnerable women, draining them financially and emotionally. In Shirley's case, the outcome was deadly. Michael's trial began in Baldwin County, Alabama, gripping the small community with disbelief and anger. Once seen smiling in family photos with Shirley, Michael now stood accused of first-degree murder. Prosecutors focused their strategy on proving intent, motive, and premeditation. Every detail, they argued, demonstrated that the crime was deliberate. The timeline was critical. Prosecutors outlined how Shirley was last heard from on March 21, 2010. Her car, purse, and phone were left behind. Michael's accounts of her disappearance were riddled with inconsistencies. Detectives testified about the grave, describing it as hastily dug and shallow but deliberately hidden under a blue tarp and littered with debris. Medical experts confirmed Shirley's death resulted from asphyxiation, likely due to the duct tape wrapped around her face. Gruesome crime scene photos were shown in court, depicting Shirley's bound and wrapped body buried close to her home. The images were unbearable for her family, with some leaving the courtroom, while others silently leaned on one another for support. Financial records presented by the prosecution revealed that Shirley had been funding Michael's lifestyle, covering expenses like the mortgage and his truck. Her daughter Sharon and brother Ricky testified that Shirley had grown increasingly frustrated in the weeks before her death. She had started setting boundaries, saying no more often, and shared that she was contemplating changes in her life. Prosecutors argued that these actions triggered Michael's fear of losing his financial support, leading him to commit murder out of desperation. This case struck the core of the close-knit community, as neighbors mourned the loss of Shirley, generous, loving, and undeserving of what happened. Michael's defense team presented an alternative perspective. While they didn't dispute that Shirley was dead or that her body was discovered on Michael's property, they argued that her death wasn't premeditated. They claimed the tragedy resulted from an argument that spiraled out of control, causing Michael to act out of panic rather than calculated intent. They sought to depict him as an emotionally distraught man, overwhelmed and desperate, rather than a deliberate murderer. However, the jury also heard testimony from Michael's former spouses, which painted a vastly different and more disturbing picture. Two women described a history of manipulation in Michael's past relationships, including financial control, emotional abuse, and subtle threats. While the court carefully limited the scope of these testimonies, they underscored a consistent narrative. Michael appeared outwardly charming, but behaved very differently in private. Michael chose not to testify in his defense, leaving his legal team to rely solely on cross-examination and closing arguments to raise doubt. Ultimately, the evidence was overwhelming, the inconsistencies impossible to ignore, and the tragedy undeniable. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its decision. Michael Wohlschlager was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Shirley's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but no peace. No ruling could reverse the events or bring Shirley back. The courtroom offered something the family had sought since her disappearance: certainty. In that moment, they knew what had happened, even if it couldn't undo their loss. In Loxley, Alabama, a quiet, close-knit community, life eventually returned to its regular pace. Yet Shirley's absence left a void that could never be filled. Her death cast a long shadow over the town she had once served so faithfully. Her voice, once a source of praise and worship, lived on only in the memories of those who loved her. Shirley's family bore a layered grief. There was the pain of losing a mother, younger sister, and daughter. But there was also the agony of hindsight. They had felt uneasy about her quick marriage to Michael, worried about her silences, and ignored instincts that something was wrong. Despite all this, Shirley had never asked for help, a fact that haunted them deeply. She had always been the one others leaned on for support, for strength, and when she needed help herself, she chose to carry the burden alone. Shirley's daughter, Sharon, who used to call her mother daily, later admitted that she wished she had tried harder to visit earlier. However, her mom always gave the impression that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. Sharon's words expressed a poignant pain shared by many families of victims, a mix of loss and helplessness. In the churches where Shirley once led congregations in song, vigils were held in her memory. Beneath her photograph, candles flickered as pastors spoke of forgiveness, strength, and justice. They also stressed vigilance, warning how evil can often disguise itself with charm and kindness. Michael Wolschlager would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no chance of parole or appeals to undo his actions. While legal justice was served, the deeper wound, the loss of Shirley and all she brought to the world, remained unhealed. Shirley lived her life rooted in faith, believing in redemption, second chances, and the goodness of others. Ironically, it was this unwavering trust that cost her everything. But it also defined her legacy. For those who loved her, it was this light, her faith, resilience, and quiet strength that they carried forward. George Michael Zimmerman was born on October 5, 1983 in Manassas, Virginia. He was the third of 4 children in a family that blended different cultural backgrounds. His father, Robert Zimmerman Sr., a retired military officer and magistrate, was of German descent, while his mother, Gladys Zimmerman, was born in Peru and worked as a court interpreter. Their family is modest, but still maintains traditional values. From a young age, George was raised with a sense of discipline, community service, and civic responsibility. He was quiet, even withdrawn, in school. He struggled academically, but made up for it with a strong sense of loyalty and structure. After graduating from high school, he moved to Florida with vague, undefined dreams. He studied at Seminole State College intermittently, working small jobs, one as an insurance underwriter and another in a car dealership, before eventually settling into a role as a security officer for a gated community. He also volunteered with the Neighborhood Watch, viewing it not just as a task, but a responsibility. Friends and neighbors described him as someone who wanted to help, who sometimes took things too seriously, and who clearly admired law enforcement. George had, at points, voiced aspirations of becoming a police officer. He attended community forums, signed up for citizen police academies, and familiarized himself with Florida law. He wasn't in uniform, but he carried the demeanor of someone who believed he was serving and protecting. His past, however, included some red flags: an arrest for assaulting an undercover officer, a charge later dropped after completing a diversion program, and a restraining order filed during a dispute with an ex-fiancée. Nevertheless, George always considered himself a man of order and discipline. In 2009, he married Shelley, a licensed cosmetologist. The couple lived in a rented townhouse in the Retreat at Twin Lakes, a mixed-race gated community in Sanford, Florida. Though George lacked formal authority, he often took it upon himself to patrol his neighborhood, especially after a string of break-ins had left many residents uneasy. He obtained a concealed weapons permit and began carrying a Kel-Tec 9mm pistol. For him, safety was paramount, and something he felt personally charged to ensure. Trayvon Martin, born February 5, 1995 in Miami, Florida, was the youngest son of Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. Although his parents were separated, they remained cooperative and respectful in raising their children, with a primary focus on their son. Trayvon split his time between his mother's home in Miami Gardens and his father's home in Sanford, often visiting extended family on school breaks and holidays. Trayvon is curious, energetic, and brings warmth and positivity to those around him. At 17, he loved playing video games, participating in sports, listening to rap music, and once expressed his dream of becoming a pilot in school. Trayvon sometimes got into trouble. He had been suspended multiple times, including once for the possession of a small amount of a banned substance. His family admitted he made mistakes, but pointed out that he was just like any other teenage boy still navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood. While he wasn't perfect, he wasn't dangerous either. In February 2012, Trayvon was staying in Sanford with his father's fiancée, Brandy Green. His father hoped the change of pace would be good for him, a reset of sorts. Trayvon was familiar with the area, comfortable in the Retreat at Twin Lakes community. Like many boys his age, he regularly texts, listens to music, and calls his friends. One of those friends, a young woman named Rachel Jontel, would later say that Trayvon had been nervous that week, worried about a man who was watching him. George and Trayvon came from vastly different backgrounds, shaped by distinct experiences, values, and circumstances. Yet, on the night of February 26, 2012, their lives intersected in a gated community in Sanford, Florida. This chance meeting would spark a national conversation, disrupt a quiet town, and leave a lasting impact on America. What began as an ordinary Sunday in the Retreat at Twin Lakes, a neighborhood of neatly trimmed hedges and uniformed townhomes, took a tragic turn. A light rain fell over the area, and the streets were mostly quiet. Behind this calm, however, tensions were simmering within the community after a string of recent burglaries. Nervous residents whispered about unfamiliar faces, and George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old neighborhood watch captain, took it upon himself to act. George regularly patrolled the area, logging numerous calls to authorities about suspicious activity. Armed with a legally concealed 9mm handgun, he saw his role as a protector, shouldering what he believed others would not. At 7:09 p.m., George spotted a young man walking slowly in the rain and called the non-emergency police line. He reported the individual looked suspicious and up to no good. His description, a teenager in a dark hoodie and jeans. Frustration crept into his voice as he added, "These assholes, they always get away." When asked by the dispatcher if he was following the person, George confirmed he was. The dispatcher advised that they didn't need him to do that. But George had already exited his vehicle and followed the young man on foot. The man George was tracking was 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. That evening, Trayvon had walked to a nearby 7-Eleven to buy Arizona fruit juice and Skittles. On his way back, with his hoodie up to keep out the drizzle, he was on the phone with a friend, Rachel Jontel. Their conversation was lighthearted, but took a worried tone when Trayvon mentioned someone was following him. Rachel urged him to run, and he did. Then George and Trayvon come face to face, a moment filled with uncertainty. By 7:16 p.m., neighbors began calling 911, reporting a physical struggle. In the background of these frantic calls, shouts for help could be heard, followed by a gunshot. When police arrived, Trayvon was found lying face down in the grass, a fatal gunshot wound to his chest. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Nearby, George stood with minor injuries, a bloody nose and abrasions on his head. According to George, Trayvon had attacked him, punched him, and reached for his gun, fearing for his life. George said he fired in self-defense. His firearm was still in its holster when officers arrived. George was questioned but released the same night. Initially, the case garnered little attention. The police categorized the shooting as a self-defense incident, citing Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows individuals to use deadly force if they reasonably believe their life is in danger, with no obligation to retreat. For the Sanford police, this explanation appeared sufficient. No arrest was made. However, for Trayvon's parents, and eventually much of the nation, this outcome was unacceptable. The events of that night and their consequences sparked an intense and divisive national debate. In the aftermath of Trayvon's death, his parents, Tracy and Sabrina, demanded answers. Why hadn't there been an arrest? Why was no one held accountable for their son's death? Their voices grew louder as they appeared on news programs, held press conferences, and shared images of Trayvon, a smiling, affectionate teenager who dreamed of becoming a pilot. Public outrage began to build, and the community became deeply divided. For many, this wasn't just a local tragedy, but a national crisis. Trayvon was young, black, and unarmed. George was older, armed, and had been advised not to pursue Trayvon. To a significant portion of the public, the facts were painfully clear. Trayvon's hoodie became a powerful symbol of injustice. Protests erupted nationwide, with students walking out of schools and marches held from Harlem to Los Angeles, all chanting justice for Trayvon. The Sanford Police Department faced harsh criticism. Chris Serino, the case's original lead investigator, expressed doubts about George's account, even testifying later that George could have avoided the encounter altogether. However, other officers disagreed, leading to division within the department and the broader community over the decision not to arrest George. The release of the 911 tapes became a tipping point. The background of the calls included desperate cries for help, analyzed repeatedly by experts. Trayvon's mother, Sabrina, identified the voice as her son's. While George's family claimed it was George's, forensic experts could not reach a consensus. Still, the haunting sound of those screams gripped the nation. By mid-March, the pressure forced Sanford Police Chief Bill Lee to step aside temporarily. Florida's Governor, Rick Scott, appointed Angela Corey as a special prosecutor to independently investigate the case. Finally, on April 11, 2012, after weeks of mounting tension, George was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. During the announcement, Angela stated solemnly that they had not come to that decision lightly and that they had based it on the facts and the law. George turned himself in to the authorities and appeared in court, looking pale and expressionless. His initial request for bond was denied, but later granted at $150,000. Media swarmed the courtroom, while protesters gathered outside with signs, wearing hoodies pulled tightly. Inside, attorneys began preparing for a trial that would become about far more than just the guilt or innocence of one man. Evidence remained contradictory. George's injuries seemed to support his claim of being attacked, while Trayvon's autopsy revealed signs of a struggle. The trial will revolve around the perspectives and decisions regarding whose plea for help in the 911 call is justified. George claimed he was in fear for his life, while prosecutors argued Trayvon had every reason to feel afraid first. As the trial approached, Sanford prepared for the weighty proceedings. The trial would not only focus on George or Trayvon, but also ignite debates about justice, race, self-defense laws, and the devastating consequences of fear and suspicion. The courtroom became a reflection of the nation, exposing truths many sought to deny and others could never escape. At its heart was an undeniable tragedy. A teenager lost his life. A man faced criminal charges, and the nation anxiously awaited the outcome. On June 10, 2013, nearly 18 months after Trayvon's death, State of Florida v. George began at the Seminole County Criminal Justice Center. The courtroom filled with reporters, legal experts, and the families of both Trayvon and George, all watching silently. George, dressed in a suit and tie, sat beside his attorneys, facing a charge of second-degree murder that carried the possibility of life in prison. While his eyes remained fixed forward, the eyes of the nation were squarely on him. Was George defending himself? Or was he the one who initiated a deadly confrontation that could have been avoided? The question was complex and had no simple answer. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Bernie de la Rionda, argued that George was mistaken in believing that a teenager walking through his neighborhood posed a threat, and then pursued, confronted, and killed him. De la Rionda told the jury that the case was not about race, but about right and wrong, emphasizing that George's actions were wrong. Prosecutors contended that George, armed with a gun, ignored a police dispatcher's suggestion to stop following Trayvon. This decision led to the confrontation that ended in Trayvon's death. To support their case, the prosecution brought forensic experts, audio specialists, and key witnesses to reconstruct the events of that night. The jury was played 911 recordings, with the screams in the background analyzed repeatedly in court. Both Trayvon's and George's families were asked to identify the voice. The prosecutor asked Sabrina, Trayvon's mother, who she recognized the voice to be, and she replied, her voice shaking, that it was Trayvon. In contrast, Gladys, George's mother, testified that the screams belonged to her son, stating that she knew it was George, as she had heard her son screaming for his life. The trial became an emotional clash of perspectives. Trayvon's friend, Rachel, who had been on the phone with him shortly before the shooting, testified about his fear and confusion. Her testimony was deeply personal but divisive. Defense attorneys questioned her credibility, while others criticized the racial and cultural biases shaping the public's perception of her. The defense, led by Mark O'Mara, portrayed George as a man attacked by Trayvon, pinned to the ground, and beaten. They presented photos of George's bloodied nose and head injuries and called witnesses to corroborate his account. John Good, a neighbor, testified that he had seen someone in a dark hoodie on top of another person during the struggle, which matched Trayvon as the aggressor. John said that the person on the bottom had been the one yelling for help. George did not testify, following his attorney's advice. Instead, the defense relied on George's recorded statements to the police, which were played for the jury. In these interviews, George described Trayvon as the aggressor and claimed he acted in self-defense. He alleged that Trayvon had followed him, punched him, and slammed his head into the sidewalk. He stated that he had been screaming for help and had thought he was going to die. The defense aimed to establish enough reasonable doubt to show that George's actions stemmed not from malice, but from fear. Under Florida's self-defense and stand-your-ground laws, that fear justified acquittal. The courtroom atmosphere was tense throughout the trial, with emotional reactions from both families, jurors, an all-female group of 6, 5 of whom were white, carefully took notes and observed testimony. In their closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to rely on common sense, asserting that George had made a false preconception about Trayvon. De La Rionda argued that George had considered Trayvon a suspect from the start, when in fact he had every right to be there. The defense, in contrast, focused on the physical evidence and George's feelings of fear. Mark declared that there were no monsters in this matter and insisted that the only fair verdict was to declare George innocent. After more than 16 hours of deliberation over 2 days, a verdict was reached. On July 13, 2013, just after 10:00 p.m., George was found not guilty. Silence filled the courtroom. George showed little reaction as his family quietly embraced. Trayvon's parents were not present, choosing to avoid the emotional weight of the moment. News outlets announced the verdict to the nation, their tone measured but solemn. Almost immediately, demonstrations erupted across the country, some peaceful, others filled with anger and grief, all stemming from deep pain. The jury later admitted that reaching a decision had been difficult. One juror, known only as B37, shared in an interview that they had all wanted to find George guilty of something, but the law had given them nothing to convict him of. Another anonymous juror explained that George's fear for his life in that moment aligned with the case the defense presented and the legal standards they had to apply. The law ultimately determined the outcome of this case, but for many, it didn't feel like true justice. Nonetheless, the law had the final say. George was acquitted. Legally, the matter was closed, but the story, with all its pain, division, and reckoning, was far from over. George Zimmerman was found legally innocent and set free. But his real life was not the same. The world he re-entered had fundamentally shifted, and so had he. Overnight, he became a polarizing figure celebrated by some and condemned by many. In the years following his acquittal, George remained a controversial figure, frequently making headlines, not for his freedom, but for a series of troubles. He was involved in road rage incidents, domestic disputes, and public altercations. He sued media outlets and political figures, and even auctioned off the gun used in Trayvon's death. For George, freedom did not bring peace. Trayvon Martin, however, never got another chance. He remained forever 17, preserved in the final photo shared by his parents, his face youthful and his hoodie pulled over his head. Yet, his name became far bigger than his life. It resonated in conversations, classrooms, protests, and policy debates. His death became a symbol, not only for justice but for systemic reform. Trayvon's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, transformed their grief into activism. They founded the Trayvon Martin Foundation to combat gun violence and support families impacted by it. Though their pain never subsided, they carried it with grace and turned it into purpose, demonstrating how dignity could exist in the face of profound loss. The trial's impact rippled across the United States. Trayvon's hoodie became a symbol of defiance. His tragic story sparked urgent dialogue about race, profiling, and perception. For many, His death marked a turning point, a moment when either something broke or something awakened. This loss fueled a movement, giving rise to a rallying cry: Black Lives Matter. Sanford, Florida, once an unremarkable city, became a focal point of America's ongoing struggle with race and justice. The police force underwent changes in leadership, and community initiatives intensified. Yet, the weight of those events never truly lifted. That night and its aftermath left a lasting impression not only on Sanford, but on the entire nation. Years later, the same questions lingered. What if George had stayed in his car? What if someone had stepped in earlier? What if Trayvon Martin had survived? There are no definitive answers, only pain, and the harsh reality that, in that rain, the encounter between an armed man and a black teenager forever changed the way America saw itself. On the surface, November 18, 2010 looked like a normal Thursday morning in suburban Atlanta. The sky was clear, the air calm, and families were caught up in their usual morning routines, preparing lunches and hurrying to drop the kids off at school. In the Snyderman household, Rusty Snyderman was doing just that. After breakfast with his family, he kissed his wife goodbye, loaded his 2-year-old son Ian into the car, buckled him in, and drove to Dunwoody Prep, a small daycare center in a safe, middle-class neighborhood. Rusty, 36 years old, is a Harvard graduate entrepreneur. He has built a stable and successful life for his wife, Andrea, and their 2 children, Ian and Sophia. Friends described him as charming, loyal, energetic, and endlessly optimistic. He took great pride in his role as a father, always present and enthusiastic in caring for his children. But as he walked Ian into daycare that morning, an unseen danger was stalking him. After dropping Ian off and exchanging pleasantries with other parents, Rusty made his way back to his car. Suddenly, the quiet morning shattered. A man emerged, raised a gun, and fired 3 shots at close range. One bullet struck Rusty in the neck, and he collapsed onto the asphalt as horrified parents and teachers froze in shock. Blood surrounded him as he lay motionless. He didn't scream or struggle. It was an abrupt, calculated killing. The shooter then calmly walked back to his silver van and drove away. Rusty died instantly, just steps from the daycare playground. Close enough for the children to hear, but his son Ian remained inside, safe and unaware that he'd just said goodbye to his father for the last time. The city of Dunwoody was in shock. Who would carry out such a bold and brutal murder in broad daylight, in front of children, and why? Who could want Rusty dead? As investigators delved into Rusty's life, they uncovered a web of secrets darker and more complex than anyone had imagined. It was a story entangled with infidelity, manipulation, obsession, and ultimately, murder. The truth unveiled a world where appearances were deceiving and no one could be trusted. Rusty Snyderman was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, in a close-knit, loving Jewish family. From an early age, he was marked by charm, humor, and kindness. As the youngest in his family, Rusty grew up surrounded by love, high expectations, and strong traditions. He thrived academically, but his greatest gift was the way he made others feel valued and understood. By his teenage years, Rusty had developed a knack for leadership. He organized school events, volunteered, and built enduring friendships. Success wasn't his sole pursuit. He earned respect through his compassion and determination. After graduating high school, Rusty went on to Indiana University, where he formed a lifelong bond with Josh Gollum, one of his closest friends. It was during these college years that Rusty's life took a defining turn. One evening, After a relaxing night out, Rusty meets a wonderful girl, Andrea Robin Greenberg. She is smart, ambitious, and very beautiful, and Rusty is instantly attracted to her. Their bond was intense from the start. Their relationship deepened quickly, with friends noting how hard and fast Rusty had fallen for her. After graduating, Rusty pursued an MBA at Harvard Business School, one of the most prestigious programs in the nation. He worked relentlessly, motivated by his dream of building a stable and meaningful life for his future family. After earning his degree, he married Andrea, and they moved to Atlanta, Georgia, to create the life they had long envisioned. Rusty embarked on a career in finance, eventually becoming a trusted wealth manager and business consultant. His clients valued his expertise, and his colleagues respected him. Rusty approached his work with integrity, prioritizing relationships over transactions. When Andrea gave birth to their daughter Sophia, followed by their son Ian, Rusty's sense of purpose deepened. In the suburban neighborhood of Dunwoody, the Snydermans were viewed as the picture-perfect American family. They were kind, friendly, and actively involved in the community. The kind of neighbors everyone was glad to have. Rusty took pride in their home and the life he and Andrea had built together. He adored Andrea and fully supported her aspirations. When Andrea decided to rejoin the workforce after spending time at home with their children, Rusty stood by her wholeheartedly. He encouraged her to apply for a position at General Electric GE, where she became a project manager and reported directly to a senior executive named Hemi Newman. Andrea's new job required frequent travel, including conferences, business trips, and late-night meetings. Rusty willingly took on more parenting responsibilities and remained proud of her achievements, confident in their relationship. But over time, things began to change. Andrea's travel increased, and she appeared more distracted and distant. Rusty still tried to support her, but it was hard for him to ignore some of the signs, like the late-night phone calls, the vague explanations, and the change in her demeanor. Despite these red flags, Rusty remained silent. He trusted Andrea and believed in the life they had built. Unbeknownst to Rusty, Andrea's professional relationship with her boss, Hemi Newman, had crossed a line. Hemi had grown infatuated with her, and their work lives began to overlap with their personal ones. At the time, Rusty was focused on his children and career. To outsiders, the Snydermans seemed like a stable, happy family. Behind closed doors, however, a dangerous dynamic was forming, one Rusty was entirely unaware of. The tragedy that followed didn't begin with a gunshot. It began with trust. Trust from a man who loved deeply, valued loyalty, and centered his life on family. Rusty had a thriving career, 2 beloved children, and a wife he deeply cherished. His life was full of meaning and joy. Yet all of it would be snatched away in a devastating instant. The man responsible had already entered their lives. Hemi Newman wasn't someone who instantly raised red flags. On paper, he is an experienced, intelligent engineer who takes on a leadership role at General Electric Energy in Atlanta, where he manages more than 5,000 employees. Colleagues described him as intelligent, confident, and occasionally arrogant. But beneath his polished facade, Hemi was unraveling. Though married with 2 children, his personal life was far from stable. Outwardly, he seemed successful, but privately, he was grappling with unhappiness. His marriage was crumbling, financial stress was mounting, and he appeared emotionally lost. His wife began to suspect him when he became cold, irritable, and unapproachable. And then, Andrea entered his life. Andrea Snyderman stood out at GE from the beginning. She was attractive, confident, and articulate. A woman who excelled in meetings, traveled seamlessly, and carried herself with ease. She laughed freely and admired Hemi in a way that felt absent in his own marriage, and he became captivated by her. Initially, Hemi and Andrea's relationship was purely business. However, over time, it evolved. First subtly, then intensely. They spent countless hours collaborating on presentations, attending conferences, and often sharing meals or drinks at hotel bars after meetings. Their work travels took them to places like Lake Tahoe, Denver, London, and even Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. To those around them, their connection seemed far more personal than business-related. Andrea later denied having an affair. She claimed that Hemi's feelings were unrequited, that she only saw him as a friend, and any closeness was misinterpreted. However, others have a different perspective. According to them, this relationship is emotional, flirtatious, and sometimes goes further, beyond work boundaries. Meanwhile, Rusty remained oblivious. Though aware of Andrea's frequent travel, he trusted her deeply. However, in the days leading up to his murder, Rusty grew uneasy. He noticed a suspicious man lingering near their home, a man wearing a hat, a fake mustache, and earmuffs. Alarmed by the man's presence, Rusty called 911. Rusty mentioned to the operator that he thought the man had a gun in his back pocket. His voice was steady but anxious as he explained that he didn't know who the man was, but emphasized that he didn't want the man near his house. What Rusty couldn't know was that the stranger outside was Hemi, in disguise, preparing to kill him. 8 days later, Hemi followed Rusty to the Dunwoody Prep Daycare Center, where Hemi shot him at point-blank range in front of horrified parents and teachers. How did a successful and respected executive become a murderer? The answer reveals disturbing complexities. In police custody, Hemi confessed to the murder but claimed that he wasn't in control of his actions. He explained that he suffered from hallucinations and hearing voices. One voice, resembling Barry White, urged him to kill himself. Investigators were shocked. Hemi's calm demeanor during the interrogation added to their unease. Despite his claims of mental illness, he appeared composed, methodical, and even rehearsed. While admitting to the crime, he attempted to frame it as a result of psychological turmoil. Throughout the interrogation, one name kept surfacing: Andrea. Hemi told police that he was in love with her, believing they were soulmates. He described how she confided in him about her troubled marriage and how their emotional connection gave him hope for a future together. Andrea, however, denied any romantic involvement. She stated that Hemi had overstepped boundaries, making unwanted advances, which she had firmly rejected. She maintained that she only saw him as a colleague, but Hemi's phone records contradicted her claims. In the 6 months leading up to Rusty's murder, Andrea and Hemi exchanged more than 400 calls and text messages. Their emails suggested emotional, if not romantic, intimacy. In one such email, Hemi even proposed marriage. Andrea dismissed this as silly and inappropriate, testifying that she had told him to stop and made it clear his advances were unwelcome. Yet, she had allowed him into her hotel room during work trips, traveled alone with him, confided in him, arranged to pick him up from the airport, and even moved her seat on planes to sit beside him. She never mentioned any of this to Rusty. Hemi's wife, Ariella Newman, also felt that the relationship was not strictly professional. Ariella eventually filed for separation, but by then, it was too late. Hemi had already purchased the .40 caliber handgun that would ultimately end Rusty's life. A gun dealer later testified that Hemi had approached him, claiming he needed a firearm for home protection. After the murder, Hemi contacted the same dealer again, this time to ask about how to dispose of the gun for the police. It became evident that Hemi's obsession had taken a dark and deadly turn. As investigators assembled the case, one key question remained: was he acting alone? Did Andrea manipulate Hemi into murdering her husband? Did she feed his delusions, fuel his obsession, and make him believe that her husband Rusty was the only obstacle keeping them apart? Or was she an innocent bystander caught up in the chaos of a man spiraling out of control? Andrea had claimed she didn't know Rusty had been shot until she arrived at the hospital around 11 a.m., but phone records showed she had called Rusty's father at 9:36 a.m., less than 30 minutes after the shooting, and told him that Rusty had been shot. How did she know no one had told her? Police hadn't released that information yet. Her own testimony contradicted what she had told Rusty's family. Rusty's father would later testify in court, visibly emotional, confirming that Andrea had called and said that Rusty had been shot and that she was heading to Dunwoody Prep to find out what had happened. If Andrea didn't know, why would she say that? Prosecutors were beginning to suspect that Andrea wasn't just a grieving widow. Maybe she knew more than she let on. Maybe she hadn't pulled the trigger. But had she played a part? As Hemi sat in jail awaiting trial, investigators uncovered more receipts, rental records, gun purchases. By January 2011, Hemi was charged with murder. But the question hanging over the case was no longer just about who pulled the trigger. The real question was who else knew. More than a year after the murder of Rusty Snyderman, the case finally arrived in a courtroom. The DeKalb County Courthouse was packed. Reporters, legal observers, family members all watched as the man accused of gunning down a young father at a daycare center stood trial. Hemi had confessed to pulling the trigger. Now, he wasn't fighting to prove he was innocent. He was fighting to prove he was insane. At the center of the defense strategy was one claim: Hemi wasn't in his right mind when he murdered Rusty. He was mentally ill, lost in delusions, manipulated by voices, and incapable of knowing right from wrong. His lawyers entered a plea of not guilty due to insanity. The prosecution, however, contended the opposite. He was sane, calculated, and dangerously obsessed. This was not a breakdown. It was a betrayal fueled by infatuation and selfish desire. During opening statements, the courtroom heard a bizarre explanation that completely changed the way the trial was perceived. Hemi's lawyers said he had been hearing voices for weeks before the murder. One deep, masculine voice, like Barry White's, repeatedly encouraged him to kill himself. Meanwhile, another soft, gentle voice, like Olivia Newton-John, instructed him to kill Rusty, saying that Rusty was a danger to his children. Hemi claimed that he truly believed he was protecting the Rusty's children. The story was so bizarre that it seemed beyond belief. The jury was silent, and even seasoned reporters could not hide their disbelief. A psychiatrist testified that Hemi suffered from bipolar disorder with psychotic features and was experiencing a manic, delusional episode when he committed the crime. Another expert supported this diagnosis, stating that Hemi's grip on reality had been unraveling for months, but the prosecution rejected this narrative entirely. To them, the voices were a fabrication, a calculated act. They didn't see a man spiraling out of control. They saw someone meticulously planning a murder, renting a car under a false identity, donning a disguise, driving across town, waiting, shooting, leaving. All of it pointed to premeditation. The prosecution also highlighted how Hemi deceived those around him. To them, this wasn't about mental illness. It was about jealousy, rejection, and unfulfilled desire. They argued that the true motivation behind the murder wasn't insanity. It was Andrea. The tension in the courtroom peaked when Andrea took the stand. She appeared different from before, polished and distant. Some described her as composed, while others saw arrogance in her demeanor. Andrea was asked directly if she had ever been romantically involved with Hemi, and she replied that she had not. The prosecution was prepared for this response. They presented a series of emails filled with emotionally charged messages. In one, Hemi pleaded with her to marry him. Others described shared moments, stargazing, waking up together in Denver, and walking hand in hand in Edinburgh. Andrea denied any romantic involvement, claiming that he had been infatuated, that she had tried to handle it, and that she had never encouraged it. Her testimony, however, only raised more questions. She admitted to letting Hemi into her hotel room during work trips, but maintained it was always innocent. She also admitted she never told her husband, Rusty, about Hemi's advances. Even after realizing Hemi had feelings for her, she continued to travel with him, sit beside him on flights, and take his late-night calls. The boundary between professional and personal was hopelessly blurred. When questioned about why she hadn't disclosed the nature of her relationship with Hemi to the police, Andrea said she didn't think it was relevant. But that explanation didn't sit well, neither with the prosecution nor the jury. Suspicion deepened when Rusty's father testified that Andrea had called him less than 30 minutes after the shooting and said Rusty had been shot, a fact that hadn't yet been made public. Andrea had previously claimed she didn't know about the shooting until she arrived at the hospital. Her timeline didn't add up. The prosecution seized on this inconsistency. If Andrea knew about the shooting before anyone told her, how did she know? Did Hemi warn her in advance? Did she already know it was going to happen? These questions hung heavily in the courtroom, unsettling the jury. The murder case with signs of insanity initially seemed simple, but then it became much more complicated and confusing. The defense reminded the jury that this trial was not about Andrea. Hemi was the one facing a life sentence. They repeatedly focused on Hemi's troubled past, including an abusive father and years of emotional instability. The defense argued that while Andrea may have been emotionally careless, it was Hemi who ultimately lost control. The prosecution, however, was relentless. In their closing arguments, they portrayed Hemi not as psychotic, but as calculated. They ridiculed the suggestion that voices compelled Hemi to act, mocking the idea that hearing songs by Barry White and Olivia Newton-John could justify a premeditated murder. The jury swiftly arrived at a verdict after thoroughly reviewing the evidence and testimony. Hemi Newman was declared guilty but mentally ill. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, guaranteeing he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. Andrea called the verdict a relief and described her late husband, Rusty, as an amazing man. Yet the trial had permanently altered how the public viewed her. The inconsistent testimony, coupled with her behavior and relationship with Hemi, her husband's killer, created a lingering suspicion that she could not shake. Justice came with complications. Hemi Newman would spend the rest of his life in prison, held responsible for killing Rusty Snyderman while grappling with mental illness. For Rusty's family, the verdict brought some sense of closure, but true peace remained elusive. Andrea was never charged with murder. Although she was initially charged, prosecutors later dropped the most serious charges because there was not enough evidence to clearly and convincingly prove her involvement. Instead, she was convicted of perjury and obstruction for lying under oath and misleading investigators. She served time in prison, but not for her husband's death. The case left a lasting impact. A father was killed in cold blood outside his child's daycare. His murderer was consumed by an obsession with another man's wife, and Andrea, at the heart of it all, faced a lifetime of skepticism in the court of public opinion.